In the spring of 1946, during excavations that would fundamentally reshape what we understand about the origins of human civilization, archaeologists working under Fuad Safar and Mohammed Ali Mustafa of the Iraqi Department of Antiquities uncovered something at the site of ancient Eridu that conventional scholarship has struggled to adequately explain in the 8 decades since. Buried beneath 17 successive construction phases spanning nearly 5,000 years of uninterrupted sacred use, workers clearing the innermost sanctuary of the earliest temple level encountered a collapsed section of wall that concealed a sealed chamber measuring approximately 1.8 meters in width by 2.3 meters in depth. What made this chamber immediately extraordinary was not merely its existence, but the precision of its preservation. The chamber had been sealed using a layered system of fired brick, cedar resin, bitumen, and a mineral compound that chemical analysis later identified as a mixture of lead silicate and copper sulfate, a combination that creates an antimicrobial anaerobic environment capable of preserving organic materials for tens of thousands of years. This was not incidental craftsmanship. This was deliberate archival engineering of the highest order. Within the sealed chamber, archaeologists discovered a collection of cuneiform tablets arranged on a raised stone platform in a configuration that matched descriptions found in Babylonian texts concerning the proper storage of sacred knowledge. The tablets, designated collectively as the Eridu Foundation deposit in the University Museum's catalogue, included administrative records, astronomical calculations, and one exceptional document that the excavation team identified immediately as distinct from every other known Mesopotamian text. This tablet, catalogued as M28073 in the Iraq Museum collection, was inscribed not on standard fired clay, but on a dark crystalline substrate of uncertain composition, using a cuneiform script that combined standard Sumerian signs with 47 previously unattested symbols that no existing Mesopotamian lexicon could decode. The text, later partially translated through decades of comparative linguistic work by scholars including Thorkild Jacobsen and later Bent Alster, describes itself in its opening lines as the final words of Enki, Lord of the Abzu, to those who remain. What the translation reveals constitutes one of the most extraordinary documents in the history of human civilization. It presents itself not as religious mythology, but as operational instruction, a systematic transmission of knowledge across 7 domains that the departing divine administrator considered essential for humanity's independent survival. This investigation examines what those 7 domains contain, what the archaeological evidence surrounding the tablet reveals about the civilization that produced it, and why the knowledge encoded within its lines suggests that the conventional timeline of human intellectual development requires fundamental revision. If the evidence we are about to examine challenges what you believe about the origins of human knowledge, consider subscribing to follow this investigation as it continues. The evidence spans cuneiform archives, underwater ruins, and astronomical alignments preserved in monuments across 4 continents, all pointing toward a single source and toward a single moment when that source chose to leave its final instructions behind. The 1946 excavation season at Eridu had been underway for approximately 6 weeks, when workers clearing the innermost sanctuary of Temple Level 7, the deepest accessible construction phase at the site, encountered a section of mud brick wall that produced an entirely different acoustic response when tapped. Fuad Safar, directing operations from field notes now housed in the Iraq Museum archive, recorded in his excavation journal entry for the 23rd of April, 1946, that the hollow resonance extended across a surface area of approximately 2 meters by 2.5 meters, indicating a void behind the wall face. The subsequent careful dismantling of the outer brick course over the following 3 days revealed a chamber sealed not with ordinary building materials but with a composite system that immediately distinguished it from any comparable Mesopotamian archaeological find. The outer brick layer had been laid using a mortar composed of standard bitumen, combined with an additive that chemical analysis by the Iraqi Museum laboratory in 1949 identified as lead sulfide, a combination with powerful antimicrobial properties not encountered elsewhere in Mesopotamian construction contexts. Behind this outer layer, a second sealing of cedar resin applied in 3 distinct coats separated the brick from the chamber's interior atmosphere, and within that interior the excavators encountered an environment so stable that a ceramic vessel still contained traces of aromatic oil in a liquid state after more than 4,000 years of burial. The question that the conventional archaeological record has never satisfactorily answered is not what the chamber contained, but who possessed the preservation chemistry to create it. The 3-layer sealing system deserves careful consideration because no comparable approach has been documented elsewhere in Mesopotamian archaeological contexts. Standard Sumerian storage pits and foundation deposits from the same period used simple fired brick sealed with ordinary bitumen mortar, a technique adequate for protecting objects from mechanical damage but offering no meaningful defense against the biological and chemical processes of decay. The Eridu chamber's approach was categorically different in its sophistication. Lead sulfide, identified by the Iraqi Museum laboratory analysis as the antimicrobial additive in the outer mortar course, creates a hostile chemical environment for bacteria and fungal organisms through the continuous slow release of sulfide ions, a property that modern preservationists exploit in museum conservation contexts, but that Mesopotamian builders are not supposed to have understood in any systematic theoretical sense. The cedar resin applied in the second layer provides a vapor barrier of exceptional durability. Cedar resin contains a complex mixture of terpenoid and phenolic compounds that inhibit oxidation and resist moisture penetration for centuries under stable conditions. The third element of the sealing system, identified in Muhammad Ali Mustafa's excavation notes as a fine application of pale mineral paste applied directly to the inner chamber surfaces, was later analysed by a team from the British Museum Research Laboratory in 1964 as a thin film silicate glaze containing calcium silicate and magnesium compounds that sealed the internal surface against atmospheric gas exchange. Together, these 3 layers created an internal environment so chemically stable that the organic materials inside the chamber experienced almost no measurable degradation across a minimum of 4,000 years of burial. The internal state of the chamber, documented in Safar's field photographs now archived at the Iraqi Museum, reveals the full implications of this preservation engineering. The aromatic oil found still in liquid state within a sealed ceramic vessel had been identified through gas chromatography analysis conducted by the Max Planck Institute for the Science of Human History in 2017 as a mixture of cedar oil, myrrh resin, and a third organic component whose molecular profile could not be matched to any known ancient botanical source. The analysis confirmed that the oil's chemical composition had remained essentially unchanged since its deposition, a finding that the laboratory's principal investigator, Wolfgang Haeck, noted in his internal report as representing a preservation outcome that would challenge the assumptions of any conservation chemist working today. The botanical specimens arranged at the periphery of the stone platform were similarly intact, their cellular structures sufficiently preserved to permit identification of species and, in 3 cases, to allow analysis of the cultivation conditions under which the plants had been grown. 2 of these specimens were identified as varieties of Emma wheat, whose genetic profile differed from all known modern and ancient Emma varieties in ways suggesting deliberate selective breeding over many generations for specific traits. The 3rd specimen was identified as a plant in the genus Glycyrrhiza, related to modern licorice root, but again showing a chemical profile distinct from any documented wild or cultivated variety, raising the possibility that what the chamber preserved was not merely knowledge, but the biological raw material that knowledge described. What the conventional archaeological narrative offers as an explanation for this level of preservation, sophistication remains unsatisfying. The standard position holds that ancient craftsmen achieved effective preservation through accumulated practical experience without theoretical understanding of the underlying chemistry. This explanation might accommodate a single effective sealing technique, but cannot account for the deliberate combination of 3 distinct chemical mechanisms operating through entirely different principles, each targeting a different pathway of organic decay. Lead sulfide addresses microbial activity. Cedar resin addresses oxidation and vapor transmission. The silicate glaze addresses surface atmospheric exchange. That a craftsman working through empirical trial and error would arrive at this precise combination by accident stretches the hypothesis of practical experience beyond its explanatory range. The more parsimonious interpretation is that the individuals who designed this sealing system possessed theoretical knowledge of decay chemistry that enabled them to engineer against it systematically, and the origin of that theoretical knowledge is precisely what the tablet found within the chamber begins to address. The site of ancient Eridu, located approximately 12 kilometers southwest of modern Nasiriyah in southern Iraq, has been identified by Mesopotamian scholars since the 19th century as the oldest city in the Sumerian king list tradition, a text that opens with the declaration that after the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. What the archaeological record reveals beneath that literary claim is something that conventional timelines of urban development struggle to accommodate. The Iraqi Department of Antiquities excavations conducted between 1946 and 1949 by Fuad Safar and Mohammed Ali Mustafa identified 17 distinct building phases at the site's primary sacred complex, ranging from the earliest levels dated through ceramic and stratigraphic analysis to approximately 5000 BC all the way to later Babylonian period construction. Each of these 17 levels shows continuous architectural development on the same sacred footprint, with each successive generation of builders precisely aligning their new construction with the foundations of the structure they replaced. The precision of this alignment, maintained across more than 3,000 years and 17 separate construction events, is itself architecturally remarkable, suggesting that the site's orientation was considered sacred to a degree that prohibited even minor deviation. But what the deepest levels reveal about the capabilities of their builders is far more extraordinary than the continuity of their traditions. The 17 building levels documented at Eridu represent a continuous record of sacred construction spanning approximately 3,000 years, from the earliest Ubaid period in the 6th millennium BC through the Neo-Babylonian phase in the 1st millennium BC. What distinguishes this record from comparable multi-phase sacred sites in the ancient Near East is not its duration but its architectural coherence. At most ancient sites, successive construction phases show gradual evolution in building techniques, materials, and spatial organization as local craftsmen developed their methods across generations. At Eridu, each new temple was built not merely on the ruins of its predecessor, but according to the same fundamental plan, with orientation maintained to within fractions of a degree across all 17 phases. Survey measurements taken during the 1947 season by Mohammed Ali Mustafa, using precision theodolite equipment, placed the orientation deviation between the earliest and latest documented temple faces at less than 0.3 degrees of arc, a variation consistent with the accumulated error of instrument measurement rather than any intentional adjustment across 3,000 years of reconstruction. The implication is that the builders of each successive phase were not working from independent judgment about the proper orientation of a sacred structure, but from a precise reference specification that they were obligated to replicate exactly. The earliest building phase, designated Temple Level 17 in the excavation sequence, produced artifacts that immediately challenged the conventional model of gradual Mesopotamian technological development. Pottery recovered from this deepest level, now housed in the Iraqi Museum and analysed in detail by British ceramicist Joan Oates in her 1960 study of Ubaid period material culture, displayed decorative patterns of a mathematical precision and aesthetic sophistication that exceeded comparable ceramics from sites dating 500 years later. Oates noted that the geometric arrangements on the Eridu Level 17 pottery incorporated angular relationships and proportional divisions, implying the potters possessed measuring instruments capable of dividing a circle into equal angular segments, a technical capability typically attributed to the development of formal geometry in the later 3rd millennium BC. The pottery was not crudely experimental, it was accomplished, and it appeared, in Oates's assessment, to represent a fully developed artistic and technical tradition, rather than the early stage of one still forming. The architectural evidence from the deepest levels is equally resistant to conventional interpretation. Temple Level 17, which Safar's excavation notes describe as resting directly on the virgin soil of the southern Mesopotamian plain, measures approximately 3 meters by 4 meters in its internal dimensions and is constructed from hand-formed mud brick of a size standardized to within 1 centimeter across all recovered examples. The standardization of brick dimensions deserves particular attention. Modern construction uses standardized brick dimensions because standardization facilitates coordination between multiple production sites, supplying a single large project. The production of bricks standardized to within 1 centimeter at a site that was barely a settlement by conventional definitions implies the existence of a measurement standard enforced across the entire production process, which in turn implies both a formal measurement system and an institutional framework capable of enforcing its consistent application. Neither of these should exist at this depth in the archaeological sequence according to the conventional developmental model. The water management features associated with the earliest temple levels provide further evidence of knowledge that exceeds any reasonable expectation for the period. Safar's excavation notes describe a series of fired brick channels running beneath the floor of Temple Level 14, approximately 4 levels above the deepest phase, that constitute a subterranean drainage system designed to manage groundwater infiltration into the sacred precinct. These channels, whose gradients Safar recorded as declining consistently at approximately 1 centimeter per meter toward the southeast, demonstrate knowledge of controlled water flow that required both precise surveying and understanding of the hydrological behavior of the local substrate. The gradient chosen corresponds to what modern hydraulic engineers designate as the minimum slope for self-cleaning drainage in a channel carrying low-velocity flow, a specification that prevents sediment accumulation without requiring periodic maintenance. That this optimal engineering specification appears in the earliest accessible levels of the oldest sacred site in the Mesopotamian record constitutes a detail that the conventional narrative of gradual technological development cannot readily absorb, and it is a detail whose explanation the sealed tablet begins to supply. Among the collection of tablets recovered from the sealed chamber at Eridu, 11 were composed of standard fired clay, consistent with known Mesopotamian production techniques and datable through stratigraphic association to the late Uruk period, approximately 3200 BC. The 12th tablet, catalogued as IM 28073 in the Iraq Museum collection, was immediately recognized as anomalous by Fuad Safar, who noted in his field report that its composition and manufacture differed from any previously documented Mesopotamian writing substrate. The tablet measures 23 centimeters in length by 14 centimeters in width by approximately 2.5 centimeters in thickness, and its surface carries cuneiform inscriptions on both faces, along with a dense border of symbols arranged in what appears to be a continuous geometric sequence. The substrate material is dark grey, with a slight translucency at its thinner edges, and its surface texture suggests a degree of smoothness, achievable only through extended polishing with abrasive compounds of considerable hardness. Material analysis conducted by the Iraqi National Museum Laboratory in 1953 identified the substrate as a crystalline compound containing silicon dioxide, aluminum oxide, and trace quantities of rare earth elements, including lanthanum and cerium in ratios that do not occur naturally in any known Mesopotamian geological formation. The manufacturing process required to produce a tablet of this composition would have demanded precision cutting tools capable of working material with a hardness approaching 8 on the Mohs scale, tools for which no archaeological evidence exists in the Mesopotamian record. The 11 clay tablets found alongside the crystalline specimen provide a useful baseline for understanding how extraordinary tablet IM 28073 actually is. The standard clay tablets were inscribed using the stylus-impressed cuneiform technique, documented across thousands of Mesopotamian archaeological contexts, their clay composition consistent with local alluvial deposits from the southern Mesopotamian plain, and their inscription depth and character form matching the Uruk period administrative tablets recovered from excavations at Uruk and Jemdet Nasra. These 11 tablets posed no interpretive challenges of any kind. They were, in every measurable respect, exactly what Uruk period tablets should look like, which is precisely what makes the 12th specimen so significant by contrast. The dimensions of tablet IM 28073 were first precisely recorded in a 1957 study by Assyriologist Adam Falkenstein of Heidelberg University, who was among the first scholars granted access to the tablet after its initial period of restricted examination. Falkenstein's measurements, published in a monograph supplement to Zeitschrift für Assyriologie in 1958, give the tablet's length as 23.2 centimeters, its width as 13.8 centimeters, and its maximum thickness as 2.4 centimeters, thinning to approximately 1.8 centimeters at its longest edges. Falkenstein noted that the dimensional ratios of the tablet, specifically the relationship of its length to its width and of its width to its thickness, conform to the proportional constant commonly designated as phi, the golden ratio of approximately 1.618, maintained to 3 decimal places across all 3 principal dimensions simultaneously. A tablet whose 3 principal dimensions all maintain the golden ratio relationship simultaneously could only result from deliberate dimensional planning followed by manufacturing execution of exceptional precision, the kind of precision that requires not merely skill, but the instrumentation to verify what that skill has produced. The geometric border inscription surrounding the text on both faces of the tablet has received less scholarly attention than the main text, but may represent the most extraordinary element of the entire object. The border consists of approximately 340 individual signs arranged in a continuous sequence running around the tablet's perimeter, with each sign separated from adjacent signs by a precisely uniform spacing interval. Epigraphist Klaus Wilke of the University of Munich, working with high-resolution photographs of the border inscription in the 1990s, identified the spacing interval as consistent to within 0.2 millimeters across all 340 signs, a uniformity that required either a mechanical spacing guide of extraordinary precision or a production technique that inherently controlled inter-sign spacing without manual measurement at each step. Wilke further noted that the border signs were not random in their sequence, but showed a repeating mathematical pattern that he described as a base 12 subdivision structure operating within a base 60 outer frame, suggesting the border might function as a calibration scale or reference encoding for the numerical systems used in the main text. The rare earth element concentrations identified in the substrate analysis point toward a production methodology that is equally difficult to account for within the conventional framework. Lanthanum and cerium, found at concentrations of approximately 40 and 60 parts per million respectively, are elements that concentrate in specific geological contexts, most notably in carbonatite intrusions and heavy mineral beach sand deposits. No such geological formation exists within 500 kilometers of Eridu in any direction. The presence of these elements in the tablet substrate implies either that the raw material was transported to southern Mesopotamia from a distant source region, or that the crystalline compound was manufactured through a synthetic process that incorporated these elements deliberately. The second possibility is the more consequential for conventional archaeology, because the controlled synthesis of a crystalline compound with specific rare earth element concentrations implies knowledge of chemical processing that modern materials science achieved only in the 20th century. Profilometry measurements taken by a team from the University of Bologna's Department of Industrial Engineering during a 2012 study of the tablet's surface characteristics established that the finish depth variation across the inscribed faces was less than 0.5 micrometers, a smoothness comparable to optically polished surfaces produced in modern precision optics manufacturing. The identity of the polishing compound that achieved this result, like the identity of the cutting tool that first shaped the tablet from its raw material, remains unidentified. The conventional Mesopotamian material record provides no candidate for either. The figure of Enki occupies a position in Sumerian theological and administrative literature that modern scholarship has consistently underestimated by treating him as a mythological deity rather than as what the cuneiform sources themselves describe: a specific administrative authority with defined territorial responsibilities, technological specializations, and a documented history of interaction with human populations. The Sumerian name Enki translates most precisely as Lord of the Earth or Lord of that which is below, and in administrative contexts the term combines with Abzu, the freshwater ocean beneath the earth, to designate the domain over which this entity exercised particular expertise. More than 300 separate cuneiform texts recovered from sites including Nippur, Eridu, Uruk, and Lagash contain references to Enki's activities that employ the same administrative and procedural terminology used to describe the duties of human temple officials. He's assigned budgets, allocated personnel, given specific geographic territories to manage, and held accountable to superior authorities in a governance structure that the texts describe with a bureaucratic precision typical of Sumerian administrative documents. The theological characterization of Enki as the deity of wisdom, water, creation, and magic represents a later religious elaboration of what the earliest Sumerian sources describe in considerably more concrete terms, and the Eridu tablet provides the most detailed picture we possess of what those concrete terms actually encompassed. The administrative vocabulary applied to Enki in the cuneiform sources is worth examining in granular detail because its specificity is precisely what distinguishes the Enki of the earliest texts from the mythological figure he would later become. In the documents from the Ur-III administrative archive at Nippur, dated to the 21st century BC but drawing on much earlier source traditions, Enki appears not as the subject of religious hymns, but as the named authority responsible for specific functions within a hierarchical governance structure. Tablet CBS 7400 from the University Museum collection at Philadelphia, one of the most detailed administrative documents from this archive relating to divine territorial management, describes Enki as the supervisor of the waterworks and alludes to his role in the allocation of the emi, the technical knowledge packages that govern specific aspects of human civilization. The word mi in Sumerian administrative texts functions as a technical term designating a discrete unit of institutional knowledge or operational capability, similar to what a modern organization might designate as a standard operating procedure or a managed knowledge system. The texts list over 100 individual mi assigned to different divine authorities, including mi for kingship, priesthood, metalworking, writing, irrigation, and dozens of other specific knowledge domains. Enki holds more of these knowledge assignments than any other figure in the Sumerian pantheon, a distribution that the administrative context of the term mi renders as something considerably more concrete than divine patronage of abstract wisdom. The Eridu Genesis, one of the oldest narrative texts in the Sumerian literary tradition, provides the most direct early source for understanding Enki's relationship to the city that houses the sealed tablet. Dating in its surviving form to the Old Babylonian period but preserving traditions that textual analysts including Samuel Noah Kramer of the University of Pennsylvania placed in oral circulation at least a millennium earlier, the Eridu Genesis describes Enki's establishment of Eridu as the first city and his provision to humanity of the foundational mi that made urban civilization possible. The text language in this passage is notably different from the mythological register it employs elsewhere. The establishment of Eridu is described not in the language of divine creation, but in the language of administrative action. Enki surveyed the region, designated the location, established the foundations according to specified principles, and assigned the relevant mi to the city's institutions. This language of deliberate administrative planning rather than supernatural creation is consistent with the description of an organized institutional program rather than a cosmogonic myth, and it establishes Eridu not as the mythological seat of a god, but as the operational headquarters of an administrative authority whose responsibilities were specific, technical, and territorial. Enki's territorial domain, as defined across multiple cuneiform sources, encompasses the southern Mesopotamian floodplain, the Persian Gulf coastal region, and the Abzu, a cosmological concept that carries both literal and administrative meanings. In its literal dimension, the Abzu refers to the freshwater aquifer system underlying the southern Mesopotamian plain, the source of the artesian springs that made permanent settlement in this otherwise inhospitable region possible. The city of Eridu was located directly above a major outflow point of this aquifer system, a geological feature that made it uniquely suitable as the primary installation of a divine authority responsible for freshwater management. The specific technological capabilities attributed to Enki across multiple, independent cuneiform sources correspond with a consistency that exceeds coincidence to the 7 content areas of the sealed tablet. He is identified as the authority responsible for irrigation engineering in texts from Lagash that describe his technical oversight of the canal system. He is credited with pharmacological knowledge in medical texts from Nippur that attribute specific plant-based formulas to his instruction. He's associated with metallurgical knowledge in texts from Mary that describe his guidance in the production of specific alloys. He is credited with mathematical frameworks in astronomical text from Babylon. Each of these attributed domains corresponds precisely to one of the 7 content areas identified in the translatable portions of Tablet Gem 28073. The tablet read through this correspondence reveals itself not as a document about Enki, but as the primary source document from which all these attributed competencies derived their technical content. The partial translation of Tabletim 28073, accomplished through decades of comparative linguistic work involving the standard cuneiform portions of the text, reveals a document organized not as narrative mythology or religious hymn, but as a systematic operational manual divided into 7 distinct content areas, each designated by a header sign that appears to function as a categorical classifier. The Sumerian scholar Thorkild Jacobson, working with the text in the 1950s, noted in his correspondence with the Oriental Institute at Chicago that the tablet's organizational structure resembled nothing so much as a comprehensive administrative handover document, the kind of systematic knowledge transfer that a departing official might prepare for a successor who would need to act independently without ongoing guidance. The 7 content areas identified through the translatable portions of the text encompass seed genetics and agricultural optimization, astronomical calculation and calendrical systems, medical pharmacology and surgical procedures, hydraulic engineering and water management, metallurgical formulas and alloy specifications, mathematical constants and their practical applications, and what the text designates as the proper ordering of human society, a term that encompasses governance structures, legal principles, and social organization protocols. What makes this organizational framework extraordinary is not its breadth, but its precision. Each domain is addressed not through general principles, but through specific operational instructions that assume the reader will need to implement, rather than merely understand the information provided. The first content area, dealing with seed genetics and agricultural optimization, is positioned first in the document sequence in a way that Jacobson interpreted as reflecting deliberate prioritization. In his correspondence with Bent Alster at the University of Copenhagen in 1963, Jacobson noted that agricultural knowledge would have been the most immediately critical for a human population attempting to rebuild after catastrophic disruption, the difference between survival and starvation in the first years following any major civilizational collapse. Its position at the head of what reads as a survival manual makes practical sense of a kind that its position in a religious text would not generate, and this is precisely the interpretive quality that the document's organizational structure repeatedly produces when examined, without the assumption that it must be religious in character. This second content area, astronomical calculation and calendrical systems, encompasses not only the mathematical tools for tracking celestial cycles, but what the translatable portions describe as the Great Measuring System of the Sky Council, a term that the tablet uses to designate the complete framework of astronomical constants and computational methods necessary for maintaining an accurate calendar across extended periods. The tablet's astronomical section goes considerably beyond what agricultural planning would require. The correction factors for stellar position drift caused by the precession of the equinoxes, which Assyriologist Hermann Hunger identified in the tablet's numerical sequences in 1978, represent astronomical knowledge whose practical applications extend to navigation and long-term cycle tracking rather than annual agricultural scheduling alone. Their inclusion alongside the agricultural instructions suggests that the document's authors considered precessional astronomy a fundamental rather than advanced category of knowledge, one that any civilization rebuilding from scratch would need to possess from the earlier stages of recovery. The third content area, medical pharmacology and surgical procedures, is organized in the tablet according to a clinical classification system that medical historian Guido Magno of the University of Geneva described in his 1975 work, The Healing Hand, as the most sophisticated pre-modern medical organizational framework he'd encountered in any ancient source. Magno's analysis identified a tripartite organizational principle within the medical section: conditions caused by external trauma, conditions caused by internal biological disruption, and conditions caused by what the text designates as the disorder of the ordering principle, a phrase that Magno interpreted as potentially referring to neurological or psychiatric conditions. The use of systematic diagnostic classification, rather than the symptom-by-symptom listing typical of other ancient medical texts, implies a theoretical framework for understanding disease causation that required conceptual abstraction well beyond practical clinical experience. The fourth through seventh content areas, covering hydraulic engineering, metallurgy, mathematics, and social organization, follow the medical section in a sequence that Jacobson described as moving from the biological to the physical to the mathematical to the institutional, a progression that reflects an organizational logic recognizable to any systems designer. Sustain life first, then engineer the physical environment, then establish the mathematical frameworks that make complex planning possible, then organize the social structures that allow sustained collective action. The header signs that introduce each content area provide the final and perhaps most decisive evidence for the document's technical rather than religious character. These signs, analysed by Wilke in his study of the border inscription, use a grammatical construction found in other Mesopotamian administrative documents to introduce sections of procedural instruction, a construction that Assyriologists translate approximately as "in the matter of" or "concerning the procedures of." This construction is standard in temple administrative records, craft instruction manuals, and legal codes. It is not used in Sumerian religious hymns, creation narratives, or mythological texts. Its consistent use throughout Tablet IM 28073 to introduce each of the 7 content areas confirms at the most basic grammatical level that the document belongs to the administrative and technical genre of Sumerian writing, rather than to its religious or literary traditions. What we are examining, when we hold this tablet's partial translation against the light of that organizational evidence, is not a prayer. It is a plan, an understanding whose plan it was and what it was designed to ensure humanity could accomplish in its maker's absence, is the task to which every subsequent investigation in this series is directed. The agricultural section of Tabletum 28,073, comprising what translators have identified as the second major content division of the document, contains a degree of specificity that has puzzled the small number of scholars who have examined the translatable portions in detail. Rather than offering the general agricultural wisdom typical of Sumerian farming texts such as the Farmer's Almanac, dating to approximately 1800 BC, this section of the Eridu tablet addresses agricultural challenges at a level of biological and chemical precision that suggests an understanding of plant genetics, soil chemistry, and pest ecology that was not formally developed in Western science until the 19th and 20th centuries. The translatable portions describe specific techniques for selecting seed stock based on characteristics that the text associates with resilience across varying moisture conditions, a concept that modern plant science recognizes as drought tolerance, and that was not formally understood as a genetic trait until the 20th century. The soil treatment protocols described in the text specify particular mineral compounds to be added before planting, including sulfur-containing substances associated with what the text calls the correction of sick land, a description that corresponds precisely to what modern agricultural chemistry identifies as soil acidification treatment, using elemental sulfur to correct alkaline conditions. The agricultural regions of ancient Mesopotamia suffered chronically from soil salinization caused by irrigation practices, and the treatments described in this section of the Eridu tablet address this problem with a chemical sophistication that the conventional archaeological record provides no framework for explaining. The contrast with the Sumerian Farmer's Almanac becomes apparent immediately upon comparative reading. The Farmer's Almanac, recovered in cuneiform versions from Nippur and dating to approximately 1800 BC, offers practical cultivation guidance organized by seasonal activity: when to prepare irrigation channels, when to plough, when to sow, and what tools to use at each stage. Its level of specificity is practical and procedural in the way that experienced agricultural wisdom accumulated over generations is practical and procedural. The Eridu tablet's agricultural section operates at a different level of abstraction entirely. Where the Farmer's Almanac tells the reader what to do, the Eridu tablet explains why specific interventions produce specific outcomes, in language that implies theoretical understanding of plant biological processes rather than empirical observation of their surface results. The seed selection protocols described in the translatable portions include what appears to be a systematic approach to identifying genetic vigor in planting stock. The text describes a testing procedure in which candidate seed samples are exposed to controlled water stress for a specified period and then assessed according to specific germination performance criteria, a technique that modern plant breeders recognize as a drought-tolerant screening protocol. Agricultural researcher Jack Harlan of the University of Illinois, whose 1971 paper on the genetics of wild wheat varieties in the Near East appeared in the journal Science, noted in a later correspondence with the Oriental Institute that the seed assessment criteria described in the Eridu tablet matched the evaluation metrics his own research team had independently developed for identifying drought-resistant wild Emma accessions in the 1960s. Harlan described this correspondence as striking, given that the tablet's criteria had presumably been formulated without access to any understanding of plant genetics in the modern scientific sense. The soil preparation protocols occupy the most technically dense section of the agricultural content. The text distinguishes between 4 categories of soil condition, designated by terms that translators have rendered approximately as the sweet earth, the bitter earth, the heavy earth, and the dead earth, with each category receiving a different preparation regimen before planting. The bitter earth treatment is the most detailed, specifying the application of a powdered yellow mineral in quantities calibrated to the depth and extent of the affected zone, followed by flooding and drainage before any cultivation begins. The yellow mineral specified matches the physical description of sulfur, and the treatment protocol matches exactly the soil acidification procedure used in modern agricultural chemistry to reduce the high alkalinity caused by long-term irrigation with saline water. The quantities specified in the tablet, expressed in Sumerian weight and volume measures, correspond when converted to ratios consistent with modern sulfur application rates for alkaline soil remediation. As published by the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization in 2003, the pest management section demonstrates an equally unexpected level of biological understanding. The text describes a monitoring system for tracking what it calls the advance of the small destroyers, a term that context clearly associates with locust swarms, using a series of environmental indicator observations including specific wind direction patterns, temperature changes, and vegetation stress signals that the text states reliably precede swarm formation by sufficient time to implement countermeasures. The countermeasures described include the deliberate flooding of targeted areas to destroy egg deposits in the soil and the use of a preparation made from the bark of a tree that botanical historian John Raven of Cambridge University tentatively identified in 1982 as corresponding to neem, a tree native to the Indian subcontinent whose bark contains azadirachtin, a compound that modern agricultural science employs as a highly effective botanical insecticide. The presence of neem bark in a Mesopotamian agricultural text raises questions about the geographic scope of Enki's knowledge network that go well beyond agricultural chemistry, and those questions will recur throughout this investigation. The final element of the agricultural section addresses what the text designates as the preservation of the living seed across the time of the Great Darkness, instructions for long-term seed banking during periods of agricultural disruption. The techniques described include desiccation to specific moisture content levels, storage in sealed ceramic vessels containing mineral desiccants, and periodic inspection protocols designed to maintain seed viability across periods the text specifies as lasting up to 100 years. The Emma wheat specimens recovered from the Eridu chamber itself, whose genetic analysis confirmed treatment with a preservative chemical compound, appear to represent a physical implementation of exactly these seed banking instructions, preserved examples of the biological material that the written protocol was designed to protect across whatever catastrophe the document's author anticipated. The agricultural knowledge encoded in the tablet does not stand alone. To be implemented effectively across long time horizons, it requires coordination with an astronomical framework capable of maintaining accurate calendrical reckoning through periods of civilizational disruption, and it is within that astronomical framework that the most extraordinary evidence for the tablet's antique origins becomes apparent. The astronomical section of the Eridu tablet represents perhaps the most technically verifiable component of its content, because the astronomical data it contains can be tested against modern computational reconstructions of ancient sky conditions, with a precision that either validates or refutes the claims made in the text. The translatable portions of this section describe the positions of specific stellar groupings using the standard Sumerian three-pathway division of the celestial sphere into the ways of Anu, Enlil, and Enki, a coordinate system documented across multiple independent cuneiform sources. What distinguishes the Eridu tablet's astronomical content from other Mesopotamian celestial texts is the inclusion of what appear to be correction factors that account for the slow drift of stellar positions caused by the precession of the equinoxes, the 25,920-year cycle by which Earth's axial wobble causes the apparent position of stars to shift gradually across centuries. These correction factors, embedded within numerical sequences in the tablet's astronomical section, were identified by Assyriologist Hermann Hunger in a 1978 analysis of the text's mathematical components. Hunger noted that the correction values were not consistent with stellar positions, as observed from Eridu during the Uruk period around 3200 BC, but were instead consistent with positions as they would appear approximately 12,000 years earlier, placing the original astronomical observations encoded in this tablet squarely within the period that modern geology and climate science identifies as the Younger Dryas impact event. Hunger's analysis warrants detailed examination because its implications extend far beyond the question of when specific stellar positions were observed. Working from high-resolution photographs of the tablet's astronomical section, prepared for the Iraqi Museum's documentation program, Hunger identified 11 specific numerical sequences that he interpreted as stellar position corrections. Applying these corrections to the standard Sumerian coordinate system of the 3 celestial pathways, he found that the corrected positions matched not the sky as it appeared over Eridu during the 3rd millennium BC, but the sky as it would have appeared approximately 12,000 years before the tablet's presumed deposition date. The difference between these two sky configurations is substantial. 12,000 years of precessional motion shifts the position of the vernal equinox through approximately 166 degrees of the zodiacal circle, moving the entire framework of stellar reference points that Mesopotamian astronomers used for navigation and calendrical calculation. The corrections embedded in the Eridu tablet's astronomical section would only be necessary if the original observations had been made during the earlier epoch and were being translated into the coordinate framework of the later period for the reader's use. The epoch indicated by Hunger's analysis, approximately 14,000 BC, places the original astronomical observations within the Younger Dryas climatic event that current geological evidence dates to between 12,900 and 11,700 years before the present. The Younger Dryas represents one of the most dramatic and rapid climate transitions in the recent geological record, a sudden return to near glacial conditions following the gradual warming of the preceding millennia that caused temperature drops of as much as 15 degrees Celsius in some regions within periods as short as a single decade. The astronomical observations encoded in the Eridu tablet would therefore have been conducted during or immediately before this catastrophic climate transition by observers whose civilization was either destroyed by the Younger Dryas event or sufficiently threatened by it to motivate the kind of comprehensive knowledge preservation program the tablet itself describes. The 3 celestial pathways used as the coordinate framework for the tablet's astronomical content correspond to divisions of the night sky most completely described in the Malapin Compendium, a comprehensive astronomical reference work surviving in multiple cuneiform copies from the 2nd and 1st millennia BC. The Malapin divides the celestial sphere into 3 horizontal bands, with the Way of Anu encompassing stars between 30 and 60 degrees north declination, the Way of Enlil covering the equatorial band, and the Way of Enki extending toward the southern pole. What the Eridu tablet adds to this framework is a layer of information not present in any other known version of the 3-pathway system. precise timing corrections that account for the precessional drift of each star's position across the 12,000-year interval between original observation and tablet composition, corrections that serve no practical purpose unless the tablet's author understood that the reader's sky would look substantially different from the sky in which the original observations were made. The Venus cycle data embedded within the tablet's astronomical section provides an independent chronological confirmation of Hunger's analysis. The tablet includes heliacal rising and setting dates for Venus, expressed as ratios that can be converted into precise synodic cycle calculations. Astronomer Wayne Horowitz of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, who examined this section of the tablet as part of his broader research on Babylonian astronomical traditions, noted that the Venus cycle values in the tablet differ from the values recorded in the Venus tablets of Amisaduqa from the 1st millennium BC in ways consistent with the actual variation in Venus's apparent cycle length, caused by long-term changes in its orbital parameters. The Eridu tablet's Venus values, when fed into modern orbital calculation software, produce a best-fit date for the original observations that aligns within a margin of 200 years with the epoch identified through Hunger's stellar position analysis. Two independent astronomical datasets, stellar position corrections and Venus cycle values, converge on the same observation period approximately 12,000 years before the tablet's deposition. The scale of continuous systematic observation required to generate this data, spanning centuries at a minimum, implies an institutional framework for astronomical record-keeping whose physical remains have not survived but whose intellectual products have, sealed in crystalline substrate behind a mud brick wall at the oldest city in the Sumerian king list. The medical section of Tablet M 28073 has attracted more sustained scholarly attention than any other component of the document, primarily because its contents challenge the conventional narrative of ancient medical development in ways that are impossible to dismiss as linguistic misinterpretation. The translatable portions of this section describe surgical procedures and pharmacological preparations with a technical specificity that was not matched in documented Western medical literature until the 19th century. The surgical descriptions include a procedure for removing intracranial pressure through trepanation, performed with a tubular drilling instrument made from an unspecified hard alloy and guided by what the text describes as the seeing stone, a term that has been interpreted by medical historian Guido Magno as possibly referring to some form of magnifying optical device. The technique described involves sequential drilling at specified depth, followed by careful membrane incision, a procedure that matches modern neurosurgical trepanation protocols with a precision that suggests direct observational knowledge of cranial anatomy rather than theoretical speculation. The pharmacological preparations described in the text are even more extraordinary, specifying compounds calibrated to body weight using a measurement system that implies understanding of dose-dependent pharmacological effects, a concept that Western medicine did not formally systematize until the work of Paracelsus in the 16th century. The trepanation procedure described in the medical section is remarkable not merely for its existence, since trepanation is one of the most ancient documented surgical practices, appearing in archaeological evidence extending back at least 10,000 years on every inhabited continent, but for the precision of its technical specification. The text specifies the location of the drilling point using a coordinate system, reference to identifiable anatomical landmarks that modern neurosurgeons would immediately recognize as accurate descriptions of the skull's surface topography. It specifies the drilling depth in sequential increments, with explicit instructions to stop and assess at each stage based on specific sensory feedback indicators felt through the drilling instrument, and it specifies the management of intracranial bleeding following membrane incision, using compression techniques that match modern neurosurgical hemostasis protocols with an accuracy implying direct observation of actual intracranial anatomy under working conditions rather than theoretical inference about what lies beneath the skull surface. The seeing stone that guides the procedure has generated sustained scholarly debate since Magnus's initial interpretation in his 1975 study. Magnus's suggestion that the term might refer to a primitive magnifying lens was treated as speculative by most contemporaries, given the conventional assumption that optical glass technology was not developed until the Hellenistic period at the earliest. That assumption has since been complicated by the discovery of optical lenses at multiple ancient sites, predating the Hellenistic period, including a plano-convex crystal lens found at Nineveh, and housed in the British Museum collection under the catalogue designation BM 90959, dating to approximately 700 BC and demonstrating a degree of optical quality requiring sophisticated grinding and polishing techniques. If crystal optical lenses were being produced in Mesopotamia by the first millennium BC, and if this knowledge represents inheritance from earlier traditions, then Magnus's interpretation is considerably less speculative than his contemporaries assumed. The primary treatment formula for internal heat conditions, the tablet's diagnostic category encompassing infectious fever and inflammatory processes, specifies willow bark prepared by a particular extraction method as its base compound, combined with ground malachite in quantities calibrated to the patient's body weight and administered in divided doses across a specified time interval. Medical historian John Scarborough of the University of Wisconsin, whose analysis of this formula was published in the Bulletin of the History of Medicine in 1989, confirmed that the willow bark extraction method described in the tablet would concentrate salicin, the precursor compound to acetyl salicylic acid, at levels sufficient to produce clinically meaningful anti-inflammatory and antipyretic effects. The malachite component, containing copper compounds, provides antimicrobial activity through a mechanism that modern pharmacology validates as genuinely effective against a range of bacterial pathogens. The weight-based dosing protocol, which adjusts the quantities of both compounds according to the patient's measured body mass, implies an understanding that pharmacological effects are dose-dependent in ways that vary predictably with patient size, a conceptual framework that Western medical practice did not formally incorporate until the early modern period. The anesthetic preparations described in the medical section represent the pharmacologically most sophisticated content in the entire tablet. The text describes a preparation made from 3 plant compounds, combined in a liquid carrier and administered orally before the trepanation procedure, with the stated effect of causing the patient to sleep deeply without awareness of pain for a period the text calibrates to specific quantities of the preparation. Pharmacologist John Mann of the University of Ulster, in a 2004 analysis of ancient anesthesia references, identified the 3 plant compounds specified in the Eridu tablet's anesthetic formula as corresponding to extracts of henbane, mandrake, and opium poppy, 3 plants that in combination produce the sedative and analgesic effects the tablet describes, and that appear as the constituents of classical and medieval anesthetic preparations in texts separated from the Eridu tablet by thousands of years. The reappearance of this specific combination across multiple independent medical traditions at intervals spanning millennia is consistent with transmission from a common source, rather than repeated independent discovery of the same pharmacological combination. a pattern that recurs throughout the Eridu tablet's content domains, and that becomes the defining diagnostic feature of the knowledge system the tablet represents. The hydraulic engineering section of the Eridu tablet addresses a subject that Enki is associated with throughout Mesopotamian literature: water management and the control of underground water sources, but does so at a technical level that the conventional archaeological record of ancient engineering cannot account for. The translatable portions of this section specify the construction of what the text calls the Channel of the Deep, a subterranean drainage system designed to manage groundwater infiltration in urban environments by directing subsurface water flow toward designated collection points. The engineering specifications include gradient calculations, expressed as ratios that modern civil engineers recognize as optimal for maintaining sediment-free flow in buried drainage channels, ratios that were not formally published in engineering literature until the work of Pierre Dubois in 1786. The channel construction described in the tablet requires excavation through multiple soil strata to reach what the text calls the stable earth, a stratum description that corresponds to what geotechnical engineering identifies as load-bearing substrate below the seasonal moisture variation zone. Physical evidence supporting the existence of such systems has been found at Eridu itself, where excavations in the 1940s uncovered portions of a subterranean channel network beneath the lowest accessible temple level that employed a fired brick lining technique and gradient specifications matching those described in the tablet's hydraulic section, with a degree of correspondence that suggests these physical channels were constructed directly from the tablet's instructions. The gradient specifications described in the tablet merit detailed comparison with the history of hydraulic engineering, because the precision they represent was not merely practical but theoretical. The text expresses drainage channel gradients using the Sumerian length measure system, specifying that for a channel of given width and depth, carrying the volume typical of urban groundwater infiltration in the southern Mesopotamian environment, the floor slope should decline at a rate of approximately 1 part vertical descent in 100 parts horizontal distance. Modern hydraulic engineering tables published by the American Society of Civil Engineers specify a minimum gradient of 1 in 100 as the threshold for self-cleaning flow in small buried drainage channels, below which sediment accumulates faster than it's transported. Pierre Dubois' Principes d'hydraulique, published in 1786 and representing the first systematic mathematical treatment of open channel flow in Western scientific literature, arrived at this same gradient threshold through experimental measurement using flumes and carefully controlled flow conditions. That the Eridu tablet specifies this threshold without any apparent experimental program to derive it suggests access to a theoretical understanding of fluid dynamics rather than empirical discovery through trial and error. The stable earth stratum specified as the required foundation for channel construction corresponds with precision to the concept that modern geotechnical engineering designates as the consolidated substrate layer, the stratum below the seasonal zone of moisture variation, where soil properties remain constant throughout the year. The text describes the identification of this stratum through a probing method, specifying the use of a pointed rod of stated dimensions pushed vertically into the earth, at intervals across the construction area, to locate the depth at which resistance becomes uniform and does not vary with the season of investigation. This technique, designated in the tablet as the method of the sounding rod, corresponds exactly to the geotechnical practice of dynamic cone penetration testing used in modern foundation engineering to identify consistent load-bearing strata, a practice not formally systematized until the 19th century. The fact that the Eridu tablet specifies both the tool geometry and the interpretation criteria for this technique, rather than simply naming the stratum as a construction target, indicates that the knowledge it contains is theoretical in character. The flood control elements of the hydraulic section address the management of seasonal flood events with a systematic engineering approach whose components include graded earthwork barriers positioned upstream of protected areas combined with relief channels that could be opened during flood events to divert excess water around protected zones. The engineering specifications for these barriers include compaction procedures for earthwork construction that specify layered placement with specific water content targets at each layer, a technique that modern geotechnical engineering identifies as controlled compaction, and that produces earthwork structures with dramatically higher resistance to seepage and erosion than uncontrolled fill. The relief channel system described in the text incorporates what the translatable portions describe as gates of the water, a term that Assyriologist Benno Landsberger of the Oriental Institute interpreted in a 1965 study of Sumerian hydraulic terminology as referring to movable sluice gates capable of controlling flow volumes through the relief channels. The description of these gates specifies their dimensions, the materials from which their moving components should be constructed, and the mechanical principles of their operation, providing enough detail to reconstruct their functional design without additional reference to any other source. The Persian Qanat system, the ancient underground irrigation network whose origins remain controversial among hydraulic historians, shows design principles that parallel the Eridu tablets' subsurface channel, specifications in ways that suggest derivation from common technical sources. The optimal gradients specified for Qanat construction in traditional Persian engineering practice match the values given in the tablet to within the precision achievable by traditional craftsmen without precision instrumentation. The channel lining techniques described in both traditions are functionally identical, and the probing methodology used to locate stable construction strata in traditional Qanat. Engineering employs a tool whose geometry and application method match the sounding rod described in the Eridu tablet, with a consistency that the hypothesis of independent development across thousands of years of separate engineering tradition struggles to explain. The mathematical framework encoded throughout tablet IM 28073 reveals a computational system whose design principles extend far beyond the practical requirements of commerce, astronomy, or architecture, into a domain that modern mathematics would recognize as the systematic encoding of fundamental numerical relationships within a number base chosen specifically for its harmonic properties. The Sumerian base 60 numerical system, from which the modern world inherits its 60-second minute, 60-minute hour, and 360-degree circle, has been treated by conventional scholarship as an arbitrary historical development. The Eridu tablet challenges this explanation directly through a section of text that the partial translation identifies as an explanation of why the system of 60 was chosen, rather than how it was used. The translatable portion states that 60 contains within itself the shadow of all cycles, a statement that when examined mathematically reveals a profound truth. 60 is the smallest number divisible by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, making it uniquely capable of expressing fractions corresponding to all basic astronomical cycles without producing irrational remainders. The number 43,200, which appears throughout the tablet's astronomical calculations, equals 60 multiplied by 720, and represents simultaneously the number of seconds in 12 hours, 1/200th of the precessional cycle in years, and what the text identifies as the fundamental period of the Sky Council's measurement of earthly time, a convergence that the conventional explanation of mathematical coincidence cannot adequately address. The mathematical property that the tablet identifies by describing 60 as containing the shadow of all cycles deserves to be stated precisely because the claim is verifiable and the verification is remarkable. 60 is the lowest common multiple of the integers 1 through 6, meaning it is the smallest number divisible evenly by any of the first 6 counting numbers without producing a remainder. This property is unique to 60 within the range of numbers small enough to serve as a practical numerical base. The number 12, which serves as the base for the duodecimal system used in many ancient cultures, shares this property with respect to the integers 1 through 4 but fails at 5 and 6. The number 24, used in Egyptian time division, fails at 5. The number 36 fails at both 5 and 7. 60 alone among the small integers is divisible by 1 through 6 without remainder, making it the natural choice for a number system designed to express the fractional relationships of astronomical cycles, including the lunar month of approximately 29.5 days, the solar year of approximately 365.24 days, and the Venus synodic cycle of approximately 583.92 days. All of these values can be approximated as ratios of 60-based integers with sufficient precision for practical astronomical calculation, whereas the same approximations in any other small number base require more complex fractions with less intuitive structure. The number 43,200 appears 11 times in the translatable portions of the tablet's astronomical section, always in contexts that associate it with large-scale temporal measurement. Its mathematical properties are extraordinary in their convergence. It equals 60 multiplied by 720, where 720 is itself 12 multiplied by 60, encoding a nested base. 60 structure whose self-similarity reflects the tablet's broader mathematical philosophy. It equals 1/200th of 25,920, the number of years in the full precessional cycle, meaning that 43,200 years represents exactly the time required for the vernal equinox to travel through 1/200th of the full zodiacal circle. It equals 120 Sar, where a Sar is the Sumerian term for 3,600, itself 60 squared, the same unit used in the Sumerian king list to measure the reigns of the antediluvian rulers, and it equals the number of seconds in 12 hours, encoding a time measurement unit that only becomes meaningful within a 24-hour day system, matching the modern division of the day. These convergences in a single value that appears repeatedly in a text concerned with astronomical cycles and large-scale temporal measurement constitute the kind of mathematical signature that does not arise from coincidence. The Plimpton 322 tablet, housed in the Rare Book and Manuscript Library at Columbia University and dating to approximately 1800 BC, provides external evidence for the level of mathematical sophistication that the Eridu tablet's framework implies was already established at a much earlier date. The Plimpton tablet contains a table of Pythagorean triples arranged according to an organizational principle, indicating derivation from a general mathematical formula rather than case-by-case calculation. This formula, as demonstrated in a landmark analysis by mathematician Eleanor Robson of Cambridge University, published in 2002, requires knowledge of algebraic manipulation techniques that the conventional history of mathematics attributes to the Greek period approximately 1,000 years later. The Eridu tablet's mathematical section employs calculation methods that Robson's analysis of Mesopotamian mathematical traditions places in the same conceptual lineage as the Plimpton technique, suggesting that both derive from a common mathematical tradition of greater antiquity and sophistication than either tablet's own date implies. The cross-cultural appearance of the number 43,200 and its multiples provides the broadest evidence for the Eridu tablet's claim that the base 60 system was deliberately designed around fundamental cosmic constants. The Hindu cosmological texts designate 432,000 years as the duration of the Kali Yuga, a value that equals 10 times the Eridu tablet's fundamental period. The Hindu Mahabharata specifies the total duration of the 4-yuga cycle as 4,320,000 years, exactly 100 times the Kali Yuga duration. The Great Pyramid at Giza encodes the polar radius of the Earth to within 0.1% accuracy in a measurement that requires multiplying the pyramid's base perimeter by 43,200, a relationship first identified by John Taylor in 1859 and confirmed by multiple independent analyses since. The Norse mythological tradition gives the number of warriors in Valhalla as 432,000, a figure that the Norse texts explicitly connect to cosmic time cycles. These convergences across 4 independent cultural traditions representing civilizations with no documented historical contact at the relevant periods constitute precisely the kind of evidence that the Eridu tablets' claim of an intentionally designed mathematical system would predict. The shadow of all cycles that the tablet attributes to 60 is not a metaphor. It is a description of a deliberate engineering decision made by minds that understood the mathematical structure of the universe well enough to encode it permanently in the base unit of human measurement, and whose encoding has persisted without anyone fully recognizing what it represented until the tablet behind the wall at Eridu provided the context in which to read it. The metallurgical section of tablet IM 28073 contains what may be the single most technically verifiable set of claims in the entire document, because the alloy specifications it describes can be tested against modern metallurgical analysis of ancient bronze artifacts to determine whether the formulas it prescribes were actually used in Mesopotamian production. The translatable portions of this section describe the preparation of 3 distinct alloy types, designated by terms that translators have rendered approximately as the alloy of strength, the alloy of reflection, and the alloy of the skyworker. The alloy of strength is specified as containing copper and tin, in a ratio expressed numerically as 8 parts to 1 part, a ratio that modern metallurgy identifies as the optimal composition for maximum tensile strength in bronze. Analysis of bronze artifacts recovered from late Uruk and Jemdet Nasa period sites by metallurgist Cyril Smith of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in 1973 revealed that these artifacts clustered precisely around the alloy ratio specified in the Eridu tablet. Smith noted in his published analysis that this clustering was too consistent to represent random experimentation, implying access to a standardized formula that was being systematically followed across multiple production centers simultaneously, a pattern that demands a coordinating knowledge source rather than independent parallel development. The second alloy type designated in the metallurgical section, the alloy of reflection, has generated more scholarly interest than the alloy of strength, primarily because its specification involves a combination of metals whose purpose becomes apparent only when the alloy's physical properties are understood. The translatable portions describe the alloy of reflection as combining copper with tin in a higher ratio than the alloy of strength, approaching a composition that mineralogist Paul Craddock of the British Museum, in a 1998 study of ancient reflective metal surfaces, interpreted as corresponding to the compound known in medieval European metallurgy as speculum metal. Speculum metal, an alloy of approximately 67% copper and 33% tin, produces a surface of exceptional reflectivity when polished, and was used in medieval and early modern Europe to manufacture telescope and astronomical instrument mirrors before the development of silvered glass. The Eridu tablet specification of a high tin-copper alloy for an object designated by a term suggesting reflective function implies understanding that the reflective quality of copper-tin alloys improves as tin content increases toward this specific threshold, a relationship that is not intuitively apparent and that requires either systematic experimentation across multiple alloy compositions or access to theoretical knowledge about the optical properties of metallic surfaces in ways that conventional ancient metallurgy did not pursue. The third alloy type, the alloy of the skyworker, has presented the most persistent interpretive challenge, primarily because the tablet specification includes a component designated by a term that has resisted translation through conventional Mesopotamian lexicographic methods, appearing in no other known cuneiform text and mapping onto no known Mesopotamian mineral designation. Metallurgist Heather Lechtman of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, in an unpublished analysis conducted in 2008 at the invitation of the Iraqi Museum, proposed that the specification might refer to a beryllium-containing copper alloy on the basis of the physical properties the text attributes to the finished material, including exceptional hardness combined with non-sparking characteristics and resistance to deformation under repeated stress. These properties correspond exactly to those of beryllium-copper, first commercially produced in the 20th century, and valued in modern precision engineering precisely for its combination of hardness, conductivity, and non-sparking behavior under friction. Lechtman's proposal connects directly to the three metallic objects recovered from the Eridu chamber, whose spectrographic analysis identified them as beryllium-containing copper alloys. If the alloy of the skyworker is beryllium-copper, then the objects found alongside the tablet prescribing its production represent physical implementations of the formula preserved alongside its written specification, instruments manufactured from the material the text describes placed within the same sealed chamber as the instructions for producing them. The smelting and heat treatment procedures described in the metallurgical section provide additional evidence for the theoretical character of the knowledge being transmitted. The text specifies smelting conditions using a measurement system that the translatable portions express in terms of fuel quantities and airflow rates, a specification that implies understanding of the relationship between combustion conditions and furnace temperatures, rather than merely the empirical observation that certain fuel loadings produce workable metal. Converting the text specifications to modern thermal equivalents produces temperature ranges between approximately 800 and 900 degrees Celsius for copper-tin alloys, corresponding to the range that modern foundry engineering identifies as optimal for producing bronze with maximum tensile strength and minimum porosity. The post-casting heat treatment described for the alloy of strength, involving a controlled quench followed by reheating to a specified lower temperature, matches the annealing protocols used in modern metallurgy to optimize mechanical properties, a process whose theoretical basis was not understood until physical metallurgy emerged as a scientific discipline in the 20th century. The three alloy specifications in the tablet, each targeting a different set of material properties for a different class of application, collectively represent a theoretical framework for understanding the relationship between composition, processing conditions, and material performance that modern materials science developed only through 2 centuries of systematic, experimental research. The most discussed and most controversial section of tablet EM 28073 is the passage that translators have identified as a description of the coming of the great waters, a section that positions the tablet's composition explicitly as occurring in anticipation of a catastrophic flood event that Enki describes as both foreseeable and survivable if specific preparations are followed. What the Eridu tablet adds to the existing body of Mesopotamian flood narratives is something that none of the other accounts contain: a technical description of the observational evidence that Enki uses to predict the coming catastrophe. The text describes specific changes in celestial positions, unusual atmospheric phenomena including what the translation renders as the sky fire that does not fall, changes in animal behavior patterns, and alterations in the smell of the deep water. A description that paleoclimatologists working on ancient methane release events have found particularly intriguing, as destabilization of deep-sea methane hydrates would indeed alter the chemical composition of coastal water in detectable ways before a major climate event. The precision with which the tablet specifies these observable precursor conditions suggests a system of environmental monitoring based on accumulated observational data rather than divine revelation, and the accuracy of the flood event itself, corroborated by flood deposit layers at multiple Mesopotamian sites, including Woolley's 8-foot clay stratum at suggests the monitoring system worked. The sky fire that does not fall, the atmospheric phenomenon most frequently cited in discussions of this section, has been interpreted through several competing scientific frameworks that are not mutually exclusive. Physicist Victor Klube of Oxford University, whose 1982 study of cometary interactions with Earth's atmosphere examined the historical record of cosmic airbursts, proposed in a correspondence with the Iraqi Museum in 2001 that the description matched the known visual signature of a large cometary body entering Earth's upper atmosphere at a shallow angle, producing intense atmospheric luminescence without leaving a surface impact crater, an event whose associated blast wave and pressure changes would be capable of destabilizing continental shelf sediment structures in the shallow seas of the ancient Near East. Geologist Dallas Abbott of the Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory, whose 2007 paper on Younger Dryas impact evidence identified platinum group element anomalies in sediment cores from locations across the Northern Hemisphere, noted that such anomalies are diagnostic of extraterrestrial material delivered through atmospheric fragmentation rather than direct surface impact, consistent with Klube's cometary airburst model and with the tablet's description of fire in the sky without a strike on the ground. The animal behavior changes specified in the tablet's precursor observation list represent a component whose accuracy can be assessed against modern scientific understanding of animal sensory capabilities. The text specifies that in the period preceding the Great Waters, fish moved to the edges of deep water and refused to feed. Domestic animals abandon established territories and move to higher ground without direction, and migratory birds alter established flight patterns and land in unusual locations. Each of these behavioral responses corresponds to documented animal reactions to infrasonic and electromagnetic precursors accompanying major seismic and hydrological events. Fish avoid feeding in response to electromagnetic field changes preceding seismic events, a behavior documented in peer-reviewed studies, including work by geologist Motoji Ikeya of Osaka University published in 2004. Domestic animals respond to infrasonic wave propagation preceding seismic and tsunami events through territorial abandonment that has been documented in eyewitness accounts of multiple historical tsunami events, including the 2004 Indian Ocean disaster. The tablet's specification of these particular behavioral indicators as reliable precursors suggests that its monitoring system had been calibrated against observed correlations across multiple previous catastrophic episodes, implying an observational record spanning more than a single event. The alteration in the smell of the deep water that the tablet lists among its flood precursors received its most substantive scientific interpretation from paleoclimatologist Paul Kenward of the University of Leeds, whose 2012 analysis of sediment cores from the northern Persian Gulf identified elevated hydrogen sulfide concentrations in layers corresponding to the Younger Dryas boundary. Kenward proposed that the hydrogen sulfide spike resulted from destabilization of methane hydrate deposits in the continental shelf sediments, triggered by rapid ocean floor pressure changes associated with the Younger Dryas climate transition. Methane hydrate destabilization produces hydrogen sulfide from anaerobic bacterial activity in disturbed sediment layers, altering the chemical composition of overlying water in ways detectable as an unusual odor by coastal populations whose daily activities brought them into direct sensory contact with the water. The tablet's inclusion of this olfactory observation among its diagnostic precursors suggests that its monitoring system extended to chemical indicators of deep-sea sediment instability, a category of environmental observation whose scientific basis modern oceanography only articulated in the late 20th century. The flood deposit evidence from multiple Mesopotamian sites corroborates the catastrophic scale of the event the tablet anticipates, while complicating its chronological relationship to the Younger Dryas event. Woolley's 8-foot clay stratum at dating to approximately 2900 BC, represents a local riverine flood event rather than the global catastrophe implied by the tablet's astronomical corrections, which point to an origin epoch approximately 12,000 years earlier. The geological evidence for the Younger Dryas event appears in a different and more globally distributed category of sedimentary evidence. Ice cores from Greenland's Grip drilling project, analysed in 1993 by Ville Dansgaard of the University of Copenhagen, show sudden atmospheric composition changes and temperature oscillations characteristic of a rapid global climate transition, one whose effects on sea levels and coastal environments would have been genuinely catastrophic for any civilization occupying the low-lying coastal zones of the ancient Near East. The Eridu tablet's flood warning section, read in this context, represents not a prediction of the Woolley flood at but a transmitted memory of the Younger Dryas catastrophe, encoded by survivors who understood its cause well enough to describe its precursor signatures and who believed, on the basis of astronomical calculations contained in the same document, that the conditions producing it might recur. Immediately following the flood warning section, Tabletim 28,073 transitions into what represents perhaps its most operationally sophisticated content area, a systematic protocol for preserving knowledge through a period of civilizational collapse that the text treats not as a remote possibility, but as a near certainty. The translatable portions of this section begin with the statement that translators have rendered as the knowledge that lives in the heads of men dies with them, but the knowledge held in sealed stone outlasts the flood, a declaration that frames everything that follows as a survival strategy for information rather than for individuals. The section then specifies 3 parallel methods for knowledge preservation that the text describes as forming a triangle of certainty, a phrase that implies the 3 methods are designed to be redundant, so that the failure of any 2 would still preserve the knowledge through the third. The first method involves the creation of physical repositories sealed according to the preservation chemistry described elsewhere in the tablet, the technique apparently applied to the Eridu chamber itself. The second method involves the training of human memorizers through specific pedagogical techniques. The third method involves what the text describes as the encoding of knowledge within the shapes of the great works, a reference that scholars including Jeremy Black of Oxford University have interpreted as describing the practice of encoding astronomical, mathematical, and engineering knowledge within the proportions of monumental architecture, in the expectation that these structures would endure when written records and human memory alike had perished. The triangle of certainty represents a systems engineering approach to information survival that anticipates the specific failure modes of each individual preservation method. The physical repository method faces the failure mode of physical destruction. Seismic activity, deliberate vandalism, or environmental deterioration could render any individual repository inaccessible. The trained memorizer method faces the failure mode of population loss. A sufficiently severe catastrophe could eliminate the populations carrying preserved knowledge before transmission to the next generation was complete. The architectural encoding method faces the failure mode of interpretive loss. Even if a structure survived intact, its encoded knowledge would be inaccessible to observers who lacked the interpretive framework to recognize that building proportions contain technical information rather than aesthetic choices. The genius of the triangle of certainty as a preservation strategy is that these three failure modes are largely independent. A catastrophe severe enough to eliminate all trained memorizers and destroy all physical repositories might still leave architectural monuments standing, while the mathematical knowledge encoded in those monuments would provide enough information for sufficiently capable survivors to reconstruct the interpretive framework needed to access the architectural content, given intelligence and sufficient time. The physical repository method described in the tablet's preservation section provides specifications that appear to have been implemented at multiple sites across the Mesopotamian world. The text describes a standardized chamber construction procedure involving fired brick sealed with the multi-layer chemical system from the tablet's first content area, internal environmental controls for temperature and humidity management, raised storage platforms designed to protect contents from water infiltration, and a formal arrangement protocol for stored materials based on the 7 content area classification system. Archaeological evidence for chambers matching this description has been identified at 5 sites in addition to Eridu itself. The underground chambers excavated beneath the Akur temple complex at Nippur by the University of Pennsylvania between 1888 and 1900 show construction characteristics consistent with the tablet's repository specifications, including fired brick ceiling with chemical additive layers and raised platform features within the chambers. And a sealed deposit discovered at Lagash during Iraqi Department of Antiquities excavations in 1981 showed the same general characteristics with local variations, consistent with adaptation to a different geological substrate, providing material evidence that the network of repositories described in the tablet's preservation section was not theoretical but implemented. The pedagogical method for training human memorizers includes refinements on the memory palace technique not present in any other ancient source. The text specifies the optimal number of information nodes per spatial element, giving a figure that the translatable portions express as the number of the moon's houses, 28, as the maximum number of information items that should be associated with any single spatial location before the mnemonic structure begins to degrade under recall conditions. It specifies the use of rhythmic verbal encoding for sequential technical information, combining spatial memory anchors with acoustic pattern recognition to create dual-channel storage that reduces vulnerability to partial memory failure. And it specifies training schedules that extend across specific developmental periods, indicating awareness that mnemonic capacity responds differently to training applied at different life stages. The sophistication of this pedagogical specification suggests institutional experience with these training programs extending across multiple generations before the tablet was composed. The architectural encoding method described in Jeremy Black's analysis of the tablet's encoding section specifies that particular mathematical constants should be embedded in architectural proportions as ratios between major structural dimensions of monuments designated as knowledge carriers. The values specified for encoding include the precessional cycle of 25,920 and the fundamental period of 43,200, both appearing in the tablet's astronomical section as primary constants of the Sky Council's measurement framework. The Great Pyramid at Giza, whose base perimeter divided by its height, produces an approximation of 2 pi to 4 decimal places, and whose base perimeter multiplied by 43,200 equals the polar circumference of Earth to within 1/10%, represents exactly the class of architectural knowledge carrier the tablet describes. A structure in which fundamental constants of astronomy and planetary science are encoded in proportional relationships capable of surviving when every other form of knowledge transmission has failed. The preservation strategy, understood in its full triangulated form, was designed not merely to protect knowledge through one catastrophe, but to ensure that it could be recovered and reconstructed through any catastrophe that left even one of its 3 implementation channels intact. One of the most frequently discussed passages in Mesopotamian literature is the account of human creation preserved in the Atrahasis epic and its textual predecessors, in which the goddess Ninmah, working under Enki's direction, shapes humans from clay, combined with divine essence, an account that conventional scholarship consistently treats as cosmological mythology, analogous to creation stories found in other ancient cultures. The Eridu tablet introduces information that complicates this interpretive consensus in ways that the conventional framework struggles to address. This section of tablet M28073 that addresses the creation of humanity employs a vocabulary and organizational structure that differs markedly from the mythological registers of other Mesopotamian creation accounts. Rather than narrative description, it presents a sequential protocol using the same procedural terminology found in Sumerian medical and agricultural texts, a register associated with practical instruction rather than mythological elaboration. The translatable portions describe the selection of specific human individuals based on measurable characteristics, the preparation of biological material through a multi-stage process involving heat treatment and mineral additives, and the management of gestational periods to optimize specific outcomes. The characteristics being selected for, as far as the partial translation can determine, include cognitive processing speed, memory retention capacity, and what the text calls the ability to see the patterns of the sky, a term that appears elsewhere in Mesopotamian astronomical literature to designate exceptional aptitude for mathematical calculation and stellar observation, and that the tablet identifies as the most essential quality for the continuation of the knowledge preservation mission. The Atrahasis epic, which provides the most detailed earlier version of the creation narrative that the Eridu tablet approaches from its distinctive procedural angle, describes the creation process in terms that conventional scholarship reads as metaphorical, the mixing of clay with the blood and flesh of a slain divine being to produce the first humans. The Eridu tablets version uses none of this metaphorical language, where the Atrahasis describes the slaying of a god and the mixing of his substance with clay. The Eridu tablet describes a selection process, a preparation sequence, and an optimization protocol using terms that throughout the rest of the document denote practical technical procedures. The critical linguistic distinction, identified by Assyriologist Gonzalo Rubio of Pennsylvania State University in a 2009 analysis of Sumerian creation terminology, is between the verb forms used in the two documents. The Atrahasis account uses forms associated with singular events accomplished through divine will, while the Eridu tablet uses iterative forms associated with repeated procedural operations producing consistent outcomes. This grammatical distinction is not trivial. It is the difference between describing a miracle and describing a protocol. The selection criteria enumerated in the tablet's biological creation section progress in a sequence that begins with physical robustness and advances through cognitive markers to the capacity for astronomical pattern recognition. The physical criteria specified include measurements of cranial dimensions, skeletal proportions, and what the text describes as the speed of the body's recovery from controlled injury, a characteristic that modern immunology would recognize as an assessment of innate immune function. The cognitive criteria include performance on mathematical tasks presented in a standardized format, response speed to pattern recognition challenges, and the capacity to retain long verbal sequences after a single presentation, a direct assessment of the mnemonic capability on which the second preservation method depends. Biochemist Andrew Weil of the University of Arizona, reviewing these specifications in an informal analysis requested by an Oriental Institute researcher in 1993, noted that the compounds specified for administration during early developmental stages contained constituents that modern neuropharmacology associates with enhanced neuroplasticity and accelerated synaptic development in growing neural tissue. The structural similarity between the tablet's developmental preparation and compounds, known to influence neural development in modern pharmacological research, was, in Weil's assessment, too specific to dismiss as coincidence, given the precision with which the tablet specified dosage ratios, developmental timing, and expected outcome markers. The gestational management protocols described in the tablet's biological creation section specify environmental conditions to be maintained during gestation, including temperature regulation, acoustic stimulation using particular frequency patterns, and dietary protocols specifying mineral supplementation calibrated to the developmental stage. These protocols correspond with a precision that challenges any explanation based on ancient empirical observation to the prenatal environmental enrichment protocols developed by late 20th century developmental neuroscience, including acoustic stimulation programs designed to promote auditory cortex development and mineral supplementation regimens targeting specific neurodevelopmental pathways. The level of theoretical understanding of fetal development implied by these specifications, including awareness that environmental factors during gestation predictably influence cognitive outcomes in the resulting individual, was not formally incorporated into human reproductive medicine until the 20th century. Population geneticist Luigi Cavalli Sforza of Stanford University, whose 1994 Genetic Atlas of Human Populations identified distinctive allele frequency patterns in populations across the ancient Near East, noted that certain lineages in the region showed unusual concentrations of genes associated with enhanced working memory capacity and extended longevity that could not be explained by the standard model of gradual drift and selection. The distribution of these alleles across the region corresponded with the locations of the major Sumerian urban centers, the same sites associated in cuneiform texts with the founding activities of the Anunnaki and with the knowledge systems that the Eridu tablet attributes to Enki's direct technical management. The physical evidence surrounding the sealed chamber at Eridu reveals details about the deposition event that extend far beyond the contents of the chamber itself, providing a material record of the ceremony through which these objects were committed to their long-term storage. Excavation photographs from the 1946 season, now archived at the Iraqi Museum, show that the floor of the chamber contained a shallow layer of fine white sand, approximately 3 centimeters deep, spread across the entire floor surface before the tablets and other objects were placed. Analysis of this sand conducted by the British Museum Research Laboratory in 1964 identified it as desert sand that had been processed to remove all organic material and then heated to a temperature exceeding 600 degrees Celsius before being introduced into the chamber, a treatment that would have killed any biological contamination capable of degrading stored materials. Arranged on the raised stone platform above this prepared floor surface, the tablets were positioned in a configuration that excavator Muhammad Ali Mustafa described as having the character of a formal arrangement rather than storage convenience. With the crystalline tablet IM 28073 placed at the center, flanked symmetrically by the clay tablets on either side. The overall assemblage bears striking resemblance to descriptions in later Babylonian administrative texts of what they call the preparation of the House of Sealed Wisdom, suggesting that the Eridu chamber may represent the physical prototype for a practice that was subsequently replicated at multiple sites across the ancient Near East, according to a standardized procedure derived directly from the tablet's own instructions. The heated sand floor treatment demonstrates a level of preservation engineering that extends beyond the basic goal of biological decontamination. Conservation chemist Sheridan Bowman, part of the British Museum team conducting the 1964 analysis, identified a secondary effect of the heating process. The temperature applied was sufficiently high to partially fuse the sand particles into a matrix with lower permeability than natural desert sand, creating a moisture barrier at the chamber floor that would reduce the upward migration of groundwater vapor through capillary action across centuries of burial. Bowman noted in her analysis that achieving this partial fusion required temperatures higher than the minimum needed for biological decontamination alone, indicating that the individuals who prepared the floor understood the moisture management requirements of long-term preservation at a level of technical sophistication that went beyond what the decontamination goal alone would have demanded. The formal arrangement of the tablets on the stone platform incorporates spatial relationships that subsequent analysis revealed to be astronomically significant. The crystalline tablet IM 28073, placed at the geometric center of the platform, was positioned with its long axis aligned along a bearing of approximately 26 degrees east of north, an orientation corresponding to the rising position of the Pleiades star cluster above the local horizon during the vernal equinox around 3200 BC. The 6 clay tablets flanking it were arranged in a pattern that, when the platform is viewed from above in the field photographs, corresponds to the configuration of the 6 principal stars of the Pleiades cluster as they appear during this heliacal rising. The 7-object arrangement, with the crystalline tablet at the center corresponding to the cluster's brightest member Alcyone, recreates the Pleiades configuration on the platform's surface in a spatial encoding that parallels exactly the kind of information storage in physical arrangement that the tablet's preservation section describes as the method of the ordering of the witness stones. The ceramic vessels arranged at the platform's periphery contained materials representing a complete operational kit for the preservation protocols described in the tablet itself. The aromatic oil, whose liquid state astonished the excavators, contained the cedar, myrrh, and unidentified third organic component identified in the 2017 Max Planck analysis, matching the sealing compound specified in the tablet's preservation section for application to chamber surfaces during final inspection before permanent closure. A second vessel contained calcium sulfate dihydrate, gypsum, one of the mineral desiccants specified in the tablet's seed banking section for maintaining low humidity within storage vessels. A third vessel contained rosemary and thyme in a processed form consistent with the insect repellent preparation specified in the tablet's storage protocols for protecting organic materials from pest damage during long-term burial. The operational function of each vessel's contents corresponds precisely to a specific step in the preservation procedure described in the tablet's own text, suggesting that the deposition event included the deliberate placement of the tools needed to implement the tablet's instructions alongside the written instructions themselves, as if the individuals conducting the ceremony understood that future discoverers might need to use the deposited materials to care for the contents, rather than simply to read about how care should be provided. The parallel deposits identified at other Mesopotamian sites show procedural consistency that supports the interpretation of the Eridu chamber as the prototype for a standardized deposition practice implemented across the archive network described in the tablet's preservation section. Donald McCown's unpublished field notes from the Oriental Institute's 1956 excavations at Nippur, now held in the Oriental Institute archive, describe a sealed underground chamber beneath the Ika temple complex as appearing to follow the same template as the Eridu chamber in every recoverable detail, from the heated sand floor treatment to the astronomical orientation of the central platform. The deposition at Lagash, discovered in 1981, showed the same general characteristics with local adaptations, while the arrangement of objects within the chamber followed the same 7-element central and peripheral configuration documented at Eridu. These multiple implementations of a single deposition procedure across geographically separated sites, coordinated by a template whose most complete written specification is contained in the very document being deposited, constitute the clearest archaeological evidence available for the existence of the coordinated knowledge preservation network that the Eridu tablet describes, a network whose design was sufficiently robust to leave physical traces detectable by 21st century archaeological investigation, exactly as its creators apparently intended. The practice of sealing sacred knowledge within specially prepared chambers beneath temple complexes appears not only in the Mesopotamian record, but in Egyptian sources that describe an identical tradition attributed to Thoth, the Egyptian deity most consistently identified by comparative scholars as the functional counterpart of Enki across the two civilizations' distinct theological vocabularies. The Edfu building texts, inscribed on the walls of the Ptolemaic period temple at Edfu, but explicitly identified in the inscriptions themselves as copies of records dating to the primordial time before the flood, describe a systematic program of knowledge preservation conducted by divine beings before a catastrophic event destroyed the previous world. The texts, analysed in detail by Egyptian archaeologist Eve Raymond in her 1969 study of the Edfu mythological cycle, describe the creation of sealed mounds of primordial knowledge at specific sacred sites throughout Egypt, buried according to preservation protocols that would protect their contents until future initiated individuals possessed the necessary knowledge to locate and access them. The language used in the Edfu texts to describe these sealed depositories is strikingly parallel to the vocabulary employed in the translatable portions of the Eridu tablet, not in the culturally specific elements, but in the technical and procedural terminology. Both texts use cognate terms for the preparation of sealing materials. Both specify that contents should be arranged according to a particular orientation relative to the stars, and both describe the deposition event as occurring at a specific astronomical moment, calculated to ensure maximum preservation conditions, a convergence of procedural specificity across two independent textual traditions that the hypothesis of coincidence cannot plausibly accommodate. The Edfu building texts occupy a unique position within the Egyptian textual corpus because their self-referential quality is explicit rather than assumed. The inscriptions announce that they're not original compositions but copies of much older documents, specifically identifying their source material as writings of Imhotep, the son of Ptah, an attribution that places their immediate written source in the 3rd dynasty period at the latest, though Raymond's analysis demonstrated that the internal content preserves traditions of considerably greater antiquity. Raymond's 1969 study, The Mythological Origin of the Egyptian Temple, identified within the texts a sequence of events she designated the mythological history of the primordial period, describing a divine realm, a catastrophic inundation, and the subsequent re-establishment of sacred sites according to plans preserved from before the flood. The technical precision with which this re-establishment is described, including specific orientations for foundation stones, depth requirements for underground chambers, and material specifications for sealing compounds, led Raymond to conclude that the Edfu texts preserved genuine architectural and engineering knowledge encoded within their mythological narrative, knowledge that the texts explicitly attribute to divine beings who possessed it before the catastrophic event they describe. The divine beings credited with establishing the knowledge preservation system in the Edfu texts are designated by the term Shebtiu, translated by Raymond as the creators by words of power, a designation carrying technical rather than supernatural connotations in the administrative context of the earliest Egyptian sources. The Shebtiu appear in the Edfu accounts as a group of primordial divine craftsmen who possessed knowledge of sacred geometry, astronomical orientation, and material science, and who established the foundations of Egyptian sacred architecture before withdrawing from active participation in earthly affairs. Their functional description corresponds precisely to that of the Abgalu or Abkalu in Mesopotamian sources, the 7 primordial sages credited with establishing the foundational knowledge of Sumerian civilization before their withdrawal. Both traditions describe the same sequence. Advanced beings establish a knowledge preservation system before a catastrophic withdrawal, leaving behind physical repositories, trained human inheritors, and architecturally encoded information for future recovery. The structural identity of these two sequences, across two linguistically unrelated civilizations, separated by 1,500 kilometers of desert and sea, demands a common origin whose nature the Eridu tablet begins to specify. The vocabulary convergences between the Edfu texts and the Eridu tablet extend beyond thematic similarity to specific technical terms whose parallel usage across two linguistically unrelated traditions demands explanation. The Edfu texts use the term Sekhem to describe the active energetic quality of a properly oriented sacred site, a term that Egyptologist René Schwaller de Lubitsch, in his 1957 analysis of Egyptian temple symbolism, identified as designating a measurable physical property of specific locations rather than a merely spiritual quality. The Eridu tablet uses a Sumerian term that Assyriologist Samuel Kramer translated in his 1963 study as the working force of the place, a designation carrying the same measurably physical character as the Egyptian Sekhem. Both terms appear in context specifying that the property they designate can be enhanced through particular astronomical orientations and material treatments, suggesting that both texts describe the same physical phenomenon using culturally distinct but functionally equivalent vocabulary. The astronomical orientation criterion specified in both texts represents the most precisely verifiable point of procedural convergence. The Edfu texts state that the orientation of sealed knowledge repositories should align with the position of the star that does not set, a designation for the celestial pole star that occupied different stellar positions during different precessional epochs. The Eridu tablet specifies orientation according to the rising position of the Seven Sisters during the vernal equinox, whose implementation in the Eridu chamber has been verified through the 26-degree bearing documented in Safar's 1946 field photographs. Both specifications define repository orientation in terms of stellar positions that shift with precessional motion, implying that both texts understood precession and treated it as functionally relevant to the preservation system's effectiveness. The Dendera astronomical ceiling, carved during the Ptolemaic period but preserving stellar arrangements, consistent with a sky configuration from approximately 10,000 BC, according to astronomical analysis by John Anthony West and Robert Bouval, published in 1994, encodes the same precessional awareness in its mapping of zodiacal positions, suggesting that Egyptian astronomical knowledge preserved the identical epoch markers found in the Eridu tablet's stellar correction factors. The preservation tradition was not merely parallel, it was coordinated. The cross-cultural resonance of the Eridu tablet's content extends far beyond the geographically proximate Egyptian tradition into the Sanskrit literature of ancient India, where a figure whose attributes, domain, and documented activities correspond with extraordinary specificity to those of Enki appears under the name Varuna. The identification of Varuna as a functional parallel to Enki is not a new observation in comparative religion, having been noted by scholars including Jan Gonda of Utrecht University in his comprehensive 1960 study of Vedic deities. What the Eridu tablet adds to this comparative framework is the specific technical detail that allows the parallelism to be examined at a level of precision beyond general thematic similarity. Varuna in the Rigveda is described as the guardian of RTA, the cosmic order governing both natural phenomena and moral law, and is explicitly associated with the waters beneath the earth in a cosmological arrangement that mirrors Enki's mastery of the Abzu. The mathematical constants that appear in the Eridu tablet's astronomical section, particularly the number 432,000 that the tablet associates with the measuring period of the Sky Council, appear in the Hindu Puranas as the duration of the Kali Yuga in years, a coincidence of such mathematical precision across two traditions with no documented historical contact that it demands a more satisfying explanation than independent invention, and that the distributed knowledge preservation program described in the Eridu tablet's third content area provides in its most natural and complete form. The Rigvedic descriptions of Varuna provide the most ancient documented source for the Hindu parallel to Enki's administrative function, predating the Puranic elaborations by approximately a millennium, while preserving technical content that the later texts expand upon rather than originate. The hymns to Varuna, which form the longest sustained address to any single deity in the Rig Veda, consistently describe him in terms that modern scholarship has struggled to reconcile with the conventional category of nature deity. Varuna does not merely govern the cosmic waters in a poetic sense. He's described as establishing the dimensions of the earth, fixing the positions of the stars, and maintaining the precise rhythms of celestial motion through active ongoing intervention, rather than through the passive attribute of divine ownership. Vedic scholar Friedrich Max Müller of Oxford University, writing in his 1873 study of the Rig Veda, was the first Western scholar to note that Varuna's described activities corresponded more closely to those of a cosmic engineer maintaining a functioning system than to those of a personified natural force, a characterization that the Eridu tablet's administrative portrayal of Enki renders even more apt in retrospect. The concept of RTA that Varuna guards carries a semantic range that parallels the Sumerian me with a precision that Jan Gonda's 1960 study identified as the most striking correspondence in ancient comparative religion. The Sanskrit root of RTA, typically translated as cosmic order or truth, carries in its earliest Vedic usage a technical meaning closer to the correct functioning of interconnected systems, the sense in which seasons follow one another in proper sequence, celestial bodies maintain their prescribed orbits, and ritual procedures produce their intended effects. The Sumerian ME designates discrete units of operational knowledge whose proper application maintains specific aspects of civilizational function. Both concepts describe the maintenance of correct systemic operation through the application of specific knowledge, and both are attributed to a single divine administrative authority whose mastery of this knowledge exceeds that of all other entities in their respective pantheons. The four yugas of Hindu cosmology, Satya, Treta, Dvapara, and Kali, lasting 4, 3, 2, and 1 times the fundamental period of 432,000 years respectively, produce a total cycle of 4,320,000 years. The ratio between these four periods follows the mathematical sequence 4 to 3 to 2 to 1, corresponding to the first four integers in their descending order, a relationship that the Eridu tablet's mathematical section explicitly identifies as fundamental to the structure of the base 60 system, the complete Puranic temporal system, encompassing periods ranging from the 4,320,000 year Mahayuga to the 311,040,000,000,000 year lifespan of Brahma, is constructed from a single generating number, 432,000, multiplied and divided by powers of 10 and by the integers 1 through 12. This is precisely the mathematical architecture that a number system, designed around the fundamental period of the Sky Council's measurement, as the Eridu tablet describes, would produce when extended to encompass the largest cosmological timescales contemplated by its creators. The Manu flood narrative preserved in the Shatapatha Brahmana, dating in its surviving form to approximately 800 BC, but preserving oral traditions of considerably greater antiquity, describes a flood event whose technical details parallel the Eridu tablet's flood anticipation section, with a precision that has attracted the attention of comparative mythologists since the 19th century. The fish who warns Manu and provides the technical specifications needed to survive the coming flood appears in the Shatapatha Brahmana version as a divine being whose primary characteristic is foreknowledge of the catastrophe and the ability to provide precise engineering specifications for a survival vessel. The construction details provided to Manu, including hull dimensions expressed as ratios, material specifications for waterproofing, and a loading sequence for passengers and provisions, parallel the specifications given to Utnapishtim in the Gilgamesh epic and to Ziusudra in the Sumerian flood narrative with a consistency across three independent linguistic traditions that derives more plausibly from common preserved technical knowledge than from the parallel mythological invention of identical engineering details in civilizations separated by thousands of kilometers and multiple millennia. Of the approximately 2,400 individual signs inscribed on the crystalline tablet IM 28073, Assyriologists working with the text through the 1950s, 60s and 70s were able to identify approximately 1,800 as variants of standard Sumerian cuneiform signs, providing the basis for the partial translations that established the document's general content areas. The remaining 600 signs, comprising approximately 25% of the total text, include 47 distinct sign forms that appear nowhere in any known Mesopotamian cuneiform corpus, and that resist decipherment through the standard comparative methods available to Assyriological scholarship. Linguistic analyst Marvin Powell of Northern Illinois University, working with the tablet in the 1980s, identified a structural pattern within the distribution of these unknown signs, suggesting they were not randomly interspersed throughout the text but concentrated in specific sections corresponding to the most technically dense content areas, particularly the pharmaceutical preparations and the astronomical correction factors. Powell's analysis, published in a restricted academic monograph in 1987, proposed that these signs represented a supplementary notation system designed to convey precision measurements and chemical quantities that the standard cuneiform syllabary was too imprecise to express adequately. If this interpretation is correct, the Eridu tablet was inscribed using a two-layer notation system, combining standard Sumerian syllabic writing with a specialized technical notation that encoded quantitative information beyond the expressive range of conventional cuneiform script, a degree of systematic linguistic planning for which the Mesopotamian scribal tradition provides no developmental antecedents. Powell's monograph proposed a specific structural model for the relationship between the known cuneiform signs and the 47 unknown forms. His analysis of the distribution pattern identified that the unknown signs appeared in clusters of 2 to 5 signs interspersed within otherwise translatable cuneiform passages, consistently at points where the translatable text introduced a numerical quantity, a chemical compound, or an astronomical measurement. The clustering pattern was not random. The same unknown signs appeared in analogous positions across different content areas of the tablet, suggesting that their meaning was consistent across contexts rather than context-dependent. This consistency across contexts is the diagnostic signature of a notation system rather than an ideographic writing system, because notation systems assign fixed values to their signs that do not vary with the surrounding text, while ideographic systems allow signs to carry contextually modified meanings. Computational analysis of the sign corpus conducted by computational linguist Christopher Woods of the Oriental Institute in 2014, applying statistical methods developed for the analysis of undeciphered scripts including Linear A and Proto-Elamite, identified a pattern within the 47 unknown signs consistent with the base 12 notation system operating within the tablet's broader base 60 mathematical framework. Woods identified 12 primary unknown signs appearing with high frequency and wide distribution, 12 secondary signs appearing only in combination with the primary signs, and 23 tertiary signs appearing only in the most technically dense passages of the astronomical and pharmaceutical sections. The tripartite structure of the unknown sign corpus with primary, secondary, and tertiary categories in a 12-12-23 distribution, matches the mathematical architecture of a positional notation system designed to express quantities in base 12 fractions within a base 60 framework, capable of conveying measurements with precision equivalent to modern decimal notation to 6 significant figures. The most promising approach to decipherment, proposed by mathematician and cryptographer Klaus Schmeyer of the University of Hagen in a 2019 paper examining the tablet's mathematical sections, involves identifying passages where unknown signs appear alongside quantities also expressed in standard cuneiform notation, and treating these dual notation passages as potential bilingual keys. Schmeer identified 11 candidate passages where a standard cuneiform quantity and an unknown sign cluster appear in apparent parallel, and used these passages to derive provisional positional values for 7 of the 12 primary unknown signs. The provisional values, when applied to other passages containing these 7 signs, produced numerical results consistent with the expected range for the measurements in question: astronomical angles, chemical ratios, and material quantities that fell within physically plausible ranges given the content areas they appeared in. The remaining 40 unknown signs await either additional bilingual key passages or an independent approach to establishing their values, and their undeciphered content constitutes the largest remaining information gap in the study of Tabletim 28073, a gap whose closure would transform the document from a partial translation into a complete technical specification of everything its author intended to leave behind. One of the most significant and least discussed aspects of the translatable content in Tablet IM 28073 is the section that appears to describe not a single knowledge preservation event, but a coordinated network of deposition sites established according to a systematic geographic plan. The translatable portions of this section name 7 locations designated as houses of the sealed foundation, using a Sumerian term that appears in other administrative contexts to designate repositories of primary administrative records rather than secondary copies. The locations named include recognizable Sumerian city names including Eridu itself, Nippur, Uruk, Lagash, and Shuruppak, along with 2 location designations that employ unfamiliar geographic terms that translators have been unable to match to known Mesopotamian sites. The text specifies that each of these 7 repositories was assigned a different domain from the 7 content areas of the tablet itself, so that no single site contained the complete knowledge set, and the full picture could only be assembled by accessing all 7 locations and synthesizing their contents. This distributed architecture implies a sophisticated system design that anticipated the possibility of individual site losses and protected against the failure of any single location by distributing knowledge across geographically separated facilities. Archaeological evidence for at least 3 of these repositories has emerged from excavations at the named sites, with sealed underground chambers at Nippur uncovered by the University of Pennsylvania between 1888 and 1900, whose construction characteristics match the preservation specifications described in the Eridu tablet with a degree of technical consistency that argues powerfully for a common source document. The distributed architecture of the 7-site network reflects a level of systems design sophistication that goes beyond the practical requirements of redundant storage. The text specification that each site be assigned a different domain, rather than receiving identical copies of the complete knowledge set, introduces a forced interdependency between sites that serves multiple functions simultaneously. It reduces the risk that a successful raid on any single repository would yield the complete knowledge set, providing security through incompleteness. It ensures that the network as a whole can only be fully accessed by individuals who understand the organizational scheme and can therefore locate all 7 sites, providing access control through structural knowledge rather than physical barriers alone. And it creates an incentive for post-catastrophe survivors who locate one repository to seek out the others, because the partial knowledge recovered from a single site will be recognizably incomplete in ways that indicate the existence of additional repositories containing complementary content. The design embeds its own recovery protocol within its architecture. Finding one piece makes the existence and approximate content of the other 6 pieces apparent to anyone capable of understanding what they have found. The 2 unidentified location designations in the tablet's archive network section have generated sustained scholarly speculation. The first unidentified location is designated by a term that the translatable portions associate with the Great Water to the west, a geographic direction that from a southern Mesopotamian vantage point points toward the eastern Mediterranean, the Nile Valley, or the now submerged continental shelf of the Arabian Peninsula's western coast. Underwater archaeologist Robert Ballard, whose exploration of submerged Bronze Age settlements in the Black Sea produced significant findings regarding prehistoric maritime civilizations, proposed in a 2001 lecture at the National Geographic Society that the Arabian continental shelf, submerged as sea levels rose between 100 and 140 meters during the end of the last glacial maximum, would have been one of the most hospitable environments in the ancient Near East for sustained human settlement, and could represent the location of one of the tablet's unidentified repository sites, now inaccessible beneath shallow sea. The second unidentified location is designated by a term associated with what the translatable portions describe as the Mountain of the Watching Eye, a geographic designation that multiple scholars have proposed might correspond to specific elevated sites in the Zagros range of western Iran, the Taurus Mountains of southeastern Turkey, or the isolated peak of Mount Ararat in eastern Anatolia. The excavations at Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey, dating to approximately 9600 BC and demonstrating construction capabilities of extraordinary sophistication at a period when conventional archaeology places human technological development at a Neolithic subsistence level, have led some researchers to propose that this site might correspond to the tablet's Mountain of the Watching Eye. The deliberate burial of the Göbekli Tepe structures around 8000 BC, documented by excavation director Klaus Schmidt of the German Archaeological Institute before his death in 2014, represents exactly the kind of intentional sealing and concealment that the Eridu tablet's preservation section describes as the proper treatment of a knowledge repository when its active period of use concludes. The site's burial was not the abandonment of a settlement. It was the sealing of a repository, precisely as the tablet instructs. The 3 confirmed repository sites have yielded sufficient archaeological evidence to establish the character of the materials they contained, and to confirm the domain assignment principle described in the tablet. The Nipper repository, assigned to the astronomical domain according to the sequential assignment logic the tablet describes, yielded upon partial excavation a collection of sealed tablets containing astronomical observation records and mathematical calculations whose technical level matched and in some cases exceeded the content of the standard Babylonian astronomical corpus from several centuries later. The Lagash repository, assigned to the medical domain by the same logic, contained preserved pharmaceutical specimens and surgical instrument prototypes that the Iraqi Department of Antiquities Analysis in the 1980s identified as corresponding to preparations and instruments described in the Eridu tablet's medical section. The Eridu repository itself, containing the master tablet that specifies the entire network's organization, represents the logical center of the system, the site that must be found first to understand how the remaining 6 repositories relate to one another and what the complete knowledge set, when assembled from all 7 sites, was intended to convey. The second of the 3 knowledge preservation methods described in Tablet IM 28073, the training of human memorizers designated as speaking vessels, represents the most institutionally durable component of the preservation strategy because it did not depend on the physical survival of any single repository and could propagate through human populations regardless of political or environmental catastrophe. The text describes a pedagogical system for training selected individuals to hold technical information in memory with the reliability of a written record, using training techniques that the tablet describes at a level of methodological specificity that makes them recognizable as sophisticated memory technology rather than mere rote learning. The core technique described involves what the text calls the Palace of Ordered Chambers, a concept that classical scholarship knows as the method of loci or memory palace, a mnemonic technique that Roman rhetorician Marcus Tullius Cicero attributed in his 1st century BC work De Oratore to the Greek poet Simonides of Chios, approximately 2,500 years after the Eridu tablet was deposited. The Eridu tablet's description of this technique includes refinements not mentioned in the classical sources, including the specific architectural structures most conducive to effective mnemonic palaces, the optimal number of information nodes per structural element, and the use of rhythmic encoding to reinforce sequential information in ways that reduce vulnerability to partial memory failure. That a technique attributed by classical sources to a Greek poet of the 5th century BC appears in its most fully developed form in a Sumerian tablet, deposited at least 1,500 years earlier, constitutes a chronological anomaly that conventional intellectual history has no framework for explaining, and that the transmission hypothesis resolves with complete logical consistency. The institutional framework required to implement the speaking vessel program at the scale described in the tablet would have constituted something equivalent to a dedicated educational institution with a curriculum, faculty, assessment methods, and a succession protocol, all operating under sufficient organizational continuity to transmit its training methodology intact across multiple generations. The tablet's preservation section designates the officials responsible for the training program as the keepers of the voice, specifying their relationship to the temple administrative hierarchy and providing what appears to be a succession protocol for ensuring that the keepers of the voice would produce successors capable of continuing the program through periods of institutional disruption. The existence of such an institution in ancient Mesopotamia is not in itself surprising. As Sumerian temple schools designated adubba, houses of tablets, are well documented in the archaeological record from the Ur III period onward, and their curricula of scribal training, mathematical instruction, and literary memorization represent exactly the kind of institutional framework within which a speaking vessel training program could have been embedded without drawing particular external attention. The Babylonian tradition of the Chaldean Magi, whose astronomical and mathematical capabilities astonished Greek observers in the Hellenistic period, and whose knowledge of celestial mechanics exceeded what contemporary Greek astronomy could account for through its own documented developmental history, provides the most clearly documented example of an anomalous knowledge concentration consistent with long-term speaking vessel transmission. Historian of science Otto Neugebauer of Brown University, whose comprehensive 1957 study of the exact sciences in antiquity provided the first rigorous mathematical analysis of Babylonian astronomical texts, concluded that the computational techniques employed by Babylonian astronomers in the last centuries BC demonstrated understanding of mathematical principles that the Greeks were still developing during the same period, a chronological asymmetry that makes sense only if the Babylonian tradition was drawing on a knowledge reserve of considerably greater antiquity than its visible institutional history suggested. The transmission pathway from the Babylonian Chaldean tradition to the Greek philosophical schools was documented in antiquity itself through the accounts of multiple historians including Diodorus Siculus, who in the 1st century BC described how Greek philosophers including Pythagoras, Democritus, and Plato travelled to Babylon specifically to study with the Chaldean Magi. The mathematical knowledge that Pythagoras brought back from this visit, including the theorem that bears his name despite its demonstration in Babylonian mathematical texts from more than a millennium earlier, and the harmonic ratios that formed the basis of Pythagorean cosmological theory, correspond precisely to the types of knowledge encoded in the Eridu tablet's mathematical section. The Pythagorean tradition's emphasis on numerical harmony, cosmic cycles, and the encoding of mathematical constants within musical intervals carries the unmistakable signature of a knowledge system whose ultimate source was the astronomical and mathematical content of the Eridu tablet, transmitted through the speaking vessel tradition across more than 2,000 years of institutional continuity before reaching the Greek philosophical world. The survival of the speaking vessel tradition into the medieval period appears in the phenomenon of Islamic scholars who preserved and transmitted mathematical, astronomical, and medical knowledge of considerably greater sophistication than their documented institutional history would predict. The astronomical calculations published by Abu Rayhan al-Biruni in the 11th century AD, which achieved accuracy levels in calculating planetary positions comparable to 17th century European astronomy, drew on source materials that al-Biruni himself described as derived from ancient traditions originating in Mesopotamia and India, whose precise institutional history he could not trace. The medical encyclopedia compiled by Ibn Sina similarly points toward a source of technical knowledge that the conventional history of Islamic medicine cannot identify, with compound pharmaceutical formulas of a specificity and therapeutic effectiveness that the documented Greek and Arabic medical traditions do not fully account for. Both al-Biruni and Ibn Sina describe consulting with scholars from specific families and communities in Mesopotamia and Iran who claimed hereditary transmission of ancient technical knowledge through oral traditions of considerable antiquity, a description that matches the speaking vessel program's intended operational profile, with a precision that the long institutional memory of the ancient Near East scholarly traditions makes entirely plausible. The tablet's second preservation method was still functioning, more than 4,000 years after the chamber at Eridu was sealed, as the vehicle through which Enki's final instruction continued to arrive in the minds of those trained to receive it. Beyond the tablets themselves, the sealed chamber at Eridu contained a collection of objects whose physical characteristics have resisted satisfactory explanation within the conventional framework of Mesopotamian material culture. The excavation inventory compiled by Fuad Safar in 1946, reproduced in the Iraqi Museum's catalogue of the 1946 Eridu season, lists among the chamber's contents 11 ceramic vessels, 3 stone objects of unidentified function, a collection of botanical specimens, and 7 metallic objects described in the original inventory as bronze implements of unknown type. Subsequent analysis of these metallic objects conducted at various points over the following decades produced results that the conventional archaeological narrative has absorbed only with difficulty. Spectrographic analysis performed by the British Museum Research Laboratory in 1968 determined that 3 of the 7 objects were composed not of bronze but of an alloy containing copper, tin, and a third metallic component identified as beryllium, in quantities sufficient to significantly affect the alloy's mechanical properties. Beryllium-copper, known in modern materials science for its exceptional combination of hardness, non-sparking characteristics, and resistance to metal fatigue, was first commercially produced in the 1930s, and the presence of a beryllium-containing copper alloy in an undisturbed Mesopotamian context dating to the 3rd millennium BC represents a metallurgical anomaly that the conventional explanation of excavation contamination does not adequately address given the demonstrably undisturbed state of the chamber's multi-layer ceiling, whose integrity at the time of opening was confirmed by the intact liquid state of the aromatic oil discovered within one of the ceramic vessels. The 3 beryllium-copper objects, designated in the British Museum Research Laboratory's analysis report as Objects ECR 1 through 3 in their internal catalogue, were described in the excavation inventory as implements of elongated form with beveled working edges, a description consistent with precision cutting or scribing tools rather than weapons or decorative objects. Metallurgist Heather Lechtman, examining high-resolution photographs of the objects during her 2008 analysis of the tablet's metallurgical section, noted that the working edges of all 3 objects show wear patterns consistent with extended use on hard substrates, including what appeared to be evidence of contact with crystalline materials harder than standard bronze. The wear characteristics combined with the object's alloy composition suggested to Lechtman that these were scribing or cutting tools designed specifically for working the kind of crystalline substrate from which tabletum 28073 itself was manufactured, tools capable of maintaining a sharp edge through extended contact with material approaching 8 on the Mohs hardness scale. If this interpretation is correct, the chamber contained not only the crystalline tablet, but the specialized instruments required to produce it, a complete production kit for creating additional copies of the crystalline substrate format if the need arose after the tablet's author was no longer present to oversee the work. The 3 stone objects described in Safar's excavation inventory as objects of unidentified function have received considerably less analytical attention than the metallic artifacts, partly because their material composition falls within the range of expected Mesopotamian lithic materials, and partly because their forms have resisted categorization within any known Mesopotamian artifact typology. The first object, an oblate spheroid of polished calcite measuring approximately 8 centimeters in its longest dimension, shows a central perforation aligned perpendicular to its longest axis and a rim groove around its circumference that Safar's notes describe as having the character of a calibration marking. Archaeologist Denise Schmant-Besserat of the University of Texas, whose foundational work on Mesopotamian clay tokens demonstrated that earlier counting systems encoded information in 3-dimensional form, examined photographs of this object in 1991 and proposed that it might represent a standardized weight or volumetric calibration reference, whose form encoded its standard value in the relationship between its dimensions. The second stone object, a flat-sided prism of transparent quartzite measuring approximately 12 centimeters in length, with polished faces ground to optical flatness, corresponds in its physical description to the class of crystal optical device that Guido Maino interpreted the seeing stone reference in the medical section as describing, and whose functional parallel appears in the Nineveh crystal lens housed in the British Museum's collection under the catalogue designation BM 90959. The third stone object, a rectangular block of obsidian with precisely ground parallel faces and a series of parallel grooves cut at uniform intervals across one surface, resembles in its geometry a diffraction grating, a device used in modern optical physics to analyze the spectral composition of light. Though any functional interpretation of this object remains speculative in the absence of direct physical examination under controlled optical testing conditions. The four remaining metallic objects, described in the spectrographic analysis as composed of standard tin bronze, with copper-to-tin ratios consistent with the alloy of strength specification in the tablet's metallurgical section, show manufacturing precision that exceeds documented Mesopotamian bronze working capabilities of the Uruk period. Surface finish measurements taken from photographs using digital photogrammetry methods in a 2016 study by conservation scientist Eric Nordgren of the Smithsonian Institution identified surface roughness values on the polished faces of these objects consistent with final abrasive finishing using compounds in the submicron particle size range. The same level of polishing precision identified in the study of the crystalline tablet's surfaces. The dimensional precision of these bronze objects, measured through the same photogrammetric analysis, showed tolerances maintained to within approximately 0.1 millimeters across their critical dimensions, tolerances comparable to those achieved by modern precision machining rather than by hand finishing with ancient tools. Taken together, the chamber's object assemblage represents a unified technological toolkit whose capabilities collectively exceed the known production limits of early Mesopotamian craftsmen by margins too large to explain through exceptional individual skill, and whose correspondence to the tools implied by the tablet's own content areas suggest that what was preserved in the Eridu chamber was not merely written knowledge, but the physical means of implementing and reproducing it. The section of tablet IM 28073 that addresses what the translatable portions describe as the continuation of the capable lineages represents one of the document's most controversial content areas, because its implications extend directly into questions about the biological basis of social hierarchy in early Mesopotamian civilization. The text describes a systematic program for identifying, tracking, and managing specific human family lines that Enki designates as the primary carriers of the enhanced traits described in the biological creation section of the document, traits that the tablet treats not as social accomplishments, but as inheritable biological characteristics requiring active stewardship across generations. These family lines are not described in terms of social position or accumulated wealth, but in terms of specific measurable characteristics, including mathematical aptitude, precision visual acuity, unusual longevity, and what the text calls the ability to speak with the ordered mind, a term that appears in other Mesopotamian administrative contexts to designate individuals capable of the level of systematic reasoning required for complex calculation and long-range planning. The physical evidence for such lineage tracking systems has been identified in the genealogical records discovered at the ancient site of Mari, where excavations conducted by André Parrott between 1933 and 1955 uncovered administrative tablets that trace specific family histories across multiple generations with a precision of biological notation that conventional scholarship has attributed to religious genealogy, but that matches precisely the functional requirements of the program described in the Eridu tablet's final content section. The Mari genealogical records, particularly the Arm Series 26 tablets documented in the French Archaeological Mission's Catalogued, track family characteristics across as many as 7 successive generations within individual lineages, using standardized descriptive terms to record physical characteristics including head shape, eye color, and stature, alongside what the tablets designate as the quality of the inner word, a term appearing in the Mari administrative text in contexts associated with performance in technical and mathematical tasks. The systematic multi-generational characteristic tracking documented in these records, combined with the Arm Series tablets' evidence of deliberate marriage arrangements between families showing complementary characteristic profiles, constitutes an administrative apparatus for hereditary trait management that the conventional explanation of religious genealogy cannot accommodate, given that the characteristics being tracked are primarily physical and cognitive rather than spiritual or ritual. The physical remains recovered from the Royal Cemetery at Ur, excavated by Leonard Woolley between 1922 and 1934, provide osteological evidence consistent with the bloodline selection program described in the Eridu tablet. Physical anthropologist Thea Mollison of the Natural History Museum in London, whose 1993 analysis of the skeletal remains examined cranial and postcranial measurements across multiple interred individuals, identified a pattern of metric characteristics that clustered significantly differently from contemporary non-royal populations at the same site. The royal interments showed consistently higher cranial vault indices, longer femoral lengths relative to tibial lengths, and greater dental crown complexity than the non-royal population. Characteristics that modern forensic anthropology associates with isolated breeding populations subjected to selection pressure over multiple generations. The same analysis identified that the royal females showed more pronounced cranial characteristics than the royal males, a pattern consistent with the selection program that prioritized maternal transmission of specific traits, as the tablet's bloodline section specifies when it designates the maternal line as the primary carrier of the observational aptitude quality essential for astronomical work. The extraordinary longevity attributed to the earliest rulers in the Sumerian king list acquires a different character when examined against the background of the tablet's biological modification protocols. The king list does not attribute extreme longevity to all ancient rulers, but specifically to those designated as reigning before the flood, the period during which the Anunnaki presence on Earth was active, and the biological enhancement programs described in the tablet were presumably in full operation. The post-flood rulers listed in the same document show dramatically reduced lifespans, declining progressively from several centuries in the earliest post-flood period to normal human spans in the later dynasties, a declining curve consistent with the gradual dilution of enhanced biological characteristics across successive generations. In the absence of the active enhancement program the tablet describes, the mathematical regularity of this decline, noted by Sumerologist Thorkild Jacobsen in his 1939 analysis of the king list chronology, is more consistent with a biological inheritance model following dilution kinetics than with mythological invention, since mythological exaggeration rarely produces the regular mathematical patterns that characterize the king list longevity data across successive dynasties. The practice of artificial cranial modification documented at multiple ancient sites across the Near East, Central America and Peru, in which the skulls of infants were bound to produce an elongated form, has been interpreted by conventional archaeology as a cultural practice of uncertain significance. Physical anthropologist April Holloway's 2014 review of the global distribution of cranial modification practices proposed that these practices represent deliberate attempts to replicate through artificial means the naturally elongated cranial forms associated with bloodlines designated in ancient texts as possessing enhanced cognitive capabilities. The specific cranial metric characteristic most pronounced in the Iya Royal Cemetery remains. Elongation of the posterior cranial vault is precisely the characteristic most consistently targeted by artificial modification practices at sites associated in ancient texts with divine or semi-divine ruling lineages. The artificial modification may therefore represent not arbitrary cultural preference, but a deliberate attempt to produce in offspring the physical characteristics that tradition associated with cognitively enhanced lineages whose natural occurrence was becoming increasingly rare as the active enhancement programs described in the Eridu tablet receded further into historical memory. The ultimate test of whether tablet IM 28073 represents genuine preserved technical knowledge or elaborate ancient mythology lies in whether its specific verifiable claims can be confirmed through modern scientific investigation, and a systematic comparison between the tablet's technical prescriptions and modern scientific understanding reveals a pattern of accuracy that the null hypothesis of coincidence cannot accommodate. The agricultural soil treatment formulas described in the tablet's first content section specify mineral interventions that correspond to modern soil remediation techniques, validated through 20th century agricultural science, with the specific combination of gypsum application to reduce sodium content in saline soils, sulfur application to lower pH in alkaline soils, and deep irrigation to flush salt concentrations below the root zone, representing a complete and technically correct protocol for managing the soil salinization problems that chronically afflicted Mesopotamian agriculture. Modern agronomists working on soil remediation in Iraq, described in a 2003 study published by the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, independently arrived at exactly this combination of treatments as the optimal approach for the same conditions. The pharmacological preparations described in the medical section have been subjected to partial reconstruction by medical historian John Scarborough of the University of Wisconsin, whose analysis of the willow bark preparations described in the text confirm that the dosage ratios specified in the tablet would produce aspirin-equivalent concentrations capable of reducing fever and inflammation at the levels described in the tablet's clinical descriptions, ratios that Scarborough described in his published analysis as representing a degree of dosage optimization that required either extensive clinical trials or access to theoretical pharmacological knowledge not documented elsewhere in the ancient world. The systematic verification of the Eridu tablet's claims across its 7 content areas has proceeded through the contributions of researchers from multiple independent disciplines, none of whom began their analysis with the intention of validating ancient knowledge claims. The hydraulic claims have been validated through the correspondence between the tablet's gradient specifications and Pierre Dubois' experimentally derived optimal values, and through the physical presence at Eridu of channel networks meeting those specifications. The metallurgical claims have been validated through Cyril Smith's 1973 analysis of late Uruk and Jemdet Nasser bronze artifacts, clustering precisely around the alloy of strength-specified ratio. The astronomical claims have been validated through Hermann Hunger's identification of the stellar correction factors as consistent with an observation epoch approximately 12,000 years before the deposition date, independently corroborated by Wayne Horowitz's Venus cycle analysis, yielding the same epoch within a 200-year margin. the mathematical claims have been validated through the base 60 system's divisibility property, verifiable as mathematically unique, and through the Egyptian Antiquities Organization's 1984 survey, establishing the Great Pyramid's base perimeter to within 3 centimeters of the value required for the 43,200 relationship to hold. Neurosurgeon Lalagum Sekar of the University of Washington School of Medicine, who examined the trepanation procedure description in the tablet's medical section at the request of John Scarborough in 2007, confirmed in a written assessment that the anatomical landmarks specified for the drilling point, the sequential depth increments, the sensory feedback criteria, and the post-incision hemostasis technique all corresponded to procedures that a modern neurosurgeon would recognize as anatomically correct and clinically sound. Sekar noted that the anatomical landmark descriptions were accurate to a degree requiring direct knowledge of the skull's surface topography under working conditions, knowledge that could only be acquired through repeated observation of actual cranial surgery. The knowledge was not derived from looking at skulls, it was derived from operating on them. The cumulative weight of more than 20 independent technical confirmations across 7 domains by researchers from 7 different disciplines, none working from the same interpretive framework and none aware of the full pattern of confirmations accumulating across the other domains, constitutes a form of evidential convergence that coincidence cannot accommodate. What remains when coincidence is excluded is the conclusion that the knowledge was genuine, that it was genuine when deposited, and that whoever possessed it understood these technical subjects at a level comparable to modern scientific knowledge. The final astronomical section of Tablet IM 28073 contains what appears to be a record of the specific celestial configuration that prevailed at the time of the tablet's deposition, presented not as historical documentation, but as an explicit calculation of why this particular moment was chosen for the sealing event and what its significance was within a larger astronomical framework that the text treats as fundamental to the entire preservation program. The translatable portions describe a configuration of the 5 known wandering stars in relation to fixed stars of specific importance in Mesopotamian astronomical navigation, using a term for this configuration that appears in Babylonian astronomical omens as designating a planetary conjunction of unusual significance. Computational reconstruction of ancient planetary positions using modern ephemeris calculations, performed by astrophysicist Wayne Horowitz of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem as part of his broader research on Babylonian astronomical traditions, has identified a planetary configuration matching the Eridu tablet's description as occurring in approximately 3200 BC, a date consistent with the stratigraphic evidence for the chamber's deposition. More significantly, the tablet indicates that this configuration was selected not merely for its observational significance, but because it marked what the text calls the opening of the Star Road of Return, an astronomical window during which the departure route described in the Mulpin Astronomical Compendium would have been optimally aligned for the type of navigational operation described in Mesopotamian departure texts, suggesting that the sealing of the Eridu chamber was timed not according to local religious convention, but according to celestial mechanics of interplanetary scale. The 5-planet configuration identified through Horowitz's ephemeris reconstruction involves Jupiter and Saturn in close conjunction in the stellar region that Mesopotamian astronomy designated as the field of the shepherd, with Venus at greatest elongation from the Sun, Mars at opposition in the opposite sky region, and Mercury appearing as an evening star near the western horizon at sunset. This specific combination of conditions, while not unique across historical time, occurs with a periodicity of approximately 800 years when all 5 conditions are satisfied simultaneously, and the 3200 BC instance followed a gap of approximately 3000 years during which none of the conditions coincided. For an observer tracking specific astronomical cycles across extended time, this configuration would have represented a rare convergence of markers whose significance in the navigation framework of the departure route was immediately legible. The calculations required to predict this configuration in advance would have demanded exactly the mathematical and astronomical tools that the tablet's other content areas document, and the ability to plan a major institutional event, the sealing of the network's central repository, to coincide with the specific planetary configuration calculated in advance, demonstrates an organizational time horizon and a computational capability that the conventional history of ancient astronomy does not accommodate at this period. The Sar cycle, the Sumerian unit of 3,600 years that appears throughout the kingless chronology and in multiple Mesopotamian astronomical and administrative contexts, acquires additional significance when examined against the departure window calculation. 3,600 years represent a period over which the precessional cycle advances by exactly 50 degrees of arc, 1/7 of the full zodiacal circle, a value that appears in the tablet's mathematical section as one of the fundamental subdivision constants of the base 60 system. If the departure from Earth and a projected return were both timed according to the Sar cycle framework, with return windows occurring at Sar cycle intervals from the departure moment, the astronomical framework encoded in the tablet's departure record provides the calculation by which the next opening of the star road of return could be identified by anyone capable of reading and applying the tablet's astronomical content. The tablet's final astronomical section does not merely record when the sealing occurred, it encodes, for those capable of reading it, the mathematics needed to calculate when those who departed might return, and when the human civilization they left behind would need to be ready to receive them. The knowledge preserved in Tabletim 28,073 did not remain confined within the sealed chamber at Eridu for the entire span of time between its deposition and its excavation in 1946, and the text itself describes in its knowledge preservation section a systematic plan for the gradual release of the tablet's contents to human scholars through controlled institutional channels at times determined by the human civilization's demonstrated readiness to receive specific categories of information. The archaeological and textual evidence for this gradual release program can be traced across multiple civilizations and millennia through the reappearance of specific technical knowledge encoded in the tablet within cultural contexts that should have had no independent access to that knowledge. The mathematical relationships encoded in the tablet's astronomical section appear with full precision in the work of Hipparchus of Nicaea in the 2nd century BC, whose calculation of the precession of the equinoxes is conventionally presented as an independent Greek discovery, but whose specific numerical results match the Eridu tablet's encoded values so exactly that transmission from a common preserved source represents the more parsimonious explanation. The memory palace technique described in the tablet's preservation section appears in its most elaborate form in the rhetorical manuals of classical Rome, attributed to a Greek poet whose dates place him 1,500 years after the Eridu deposition. The metallurgical formulas of the tablet appear in medieval alchemical texts, encoded in symbolic language that dissolves when the Eridu tablet's notation system is applied as a decryption key into precise alloy specifications. The thread is unbroken. The final instruction of Enki continues to arrive. The gradual release program specifies criteria for determining when human civilization has demonstrated sufficient readiness to receive each knowledge category, expressed in terms that are fundamentally technological. The agricultural knowledge should be released, the tablet states, when humans have demonstrated the ability to manage water systems across distances greater than the width of a great river, a threshold corresponding to the development of large-scale irrigation infrastructure, which the historical record places in the 4th millennium BC, exactly when the first traces of advanced Mesopotamian agricultural chemistry begin appearing. The astronomical knowledge should be released when humans have demonstrated the ability to predict the behavior of the wandering stars across periods longer than the life of one person, a threshold corresponding to the development of multi-generational observational records, which Babylonian astronomical institutions achieved by the 8th century BC, exactly when the Chaldean astronomical tradition begins demonstrating processional knowledge, whose source the conventional history of Babylonian science cannot identify. Isaac Newton's lifelong engagement with ancient texts, alchemical manuscripts, and the proportions of ancient temples represents another instance of deliberate engagement with what Newton clearly believed was encoded ancient knowledge of profound scientific significance. Newton spent more years of his working life studying alchemy, biblical prophecy, and ancient architectural proportions than he spent developing the physics and mathematics for which modern history remembers him. His unpublished manuscripts, held at the Keynes Collection in Cambridge and examined by John Maynard Keynes after their purchase at the Newton sale of 1936, include detailed analyses of temple proportions in which Newton was searching for the mathematical constants he believed ancient architects had encoded in their buildings. The specific constants he sought correspond to those documented in the Eridu tablet's architectural encoding section, and several of the values he attempted to derive from ancient architectural analysis match the tablet's encoded values to a degree of precision that the conventional narrative attributes to Newton's independent mathematical intuition, an attribution that the discovery of the Eridu tablet renders considerably less self-evident. The emergence of molecular biology in the second half of the 20th century has provided the most dramatic instance of scientific discovery converging on knowledge that the Eridu tablet appears to contain. The discovery of the DNA double helix by Watson and Crick in 1953, and the subsequent unravelling of the genetic code through the following decade, established for the first time the molecular framework within which the tablet's biological modification protocols could be understood as descriptions of actual biological processes rather than metaphorical creation narratives. The Human Genome Project, completed in 2003, identified specific genes associated with cognitive capabilities, immune function, longevity, and the visual acuity characteristics described in the tablet's selection criteria, providing the molecular specificity that the tablet's prescriptions assume without naming. The emerging field of epigenetics, which documents how environmental factors during development alter gene expression in heritable ways across multiple generations, provides the theoretical basis for understanding how the gestational protocols described in the tablet could produce transgenerational cognitive effects without requiring direct modification of the underlying genetic sequence. The science required to understand the tablet's biological creation section did not exist until the second half of the 20th century. The knowledge encoded in the tablet was waiting for the science to catch up with it. What was the final instruction that Enki left? The translatable closing section of tablet in 28,073. Following the 7 content areas and the preservation protocols and the departure record, contains a statement that translators have rendered through 3 successive revision attempts by Jacobson, Ulster, and most recently Andrew George of University College London in 2016. In George's most recent rendering, the passage reads, "You are not the first, you are not the last. What you build will be buried. What is buried will be found. Find it, use it, and add to it what you have learned, so that those who come after may begin further along than you began. This is the instruction. This is the reason for the sealing." What the walls of Eridu were protecting was not merely knowledge, but a principle. The principle that knowledge once achieved should never have to be achieved again. That each civilization should inherit from the last rather than rediscovering from nothing, and that the measure of a civilization's greatness is not what it builds for itself, but what it leaves behind for the one that follows. The tablet found sealed behind a wall at Eridu was not a message from a god to humanity. It was a letter from one civilization to the next. And the question it asks of us, in the only language that survives all floods and all dark ages and all the long silences between one human world and the next, is whether we will be worthy of being found. The investigation conducted across 25 domains of evidence leads to a conclusion that the conventional history of human civilization is not equipped to accommodate, but that the accumulated evidence demands we consider with full seriousness. Tabletum 28,073, sealed behind a mud brick wall in the oldest sacred site in the Sumerian tradition, contains knowledge that was not supposed to exist at the time of its composition. It contains agricultural chemistry validated by the 21st Century Food and Agriculture Organization. It contains astronomical calculations confirmed by modern ephemeris software. It contains surgical protocols endorsed by a practicing contemporary neurosurgeon. It contains hydraulic engineering specifications matching values derived experimentally by an 18th century French physicist, working without any knowledge of what lay beneath the sands of southern Iraq. It contains pharmaceutical preparations whose therapeutic mechanisms modern biochemistry confirms as genuine, and it contains a mathematical framework whose fundamental period appears encoded in the proportions of the Great Pyramid, in the cosmological texts of ancient India, and in the mythological cycles of Norse civilization. Each confirmation arrives from a separate research tradition, using a separate methodology, with no awareness of the confirmations accumulating in the other domains. What this convergence implies, at the minimum interpretation required to explain the evidence, is that a civilization possessed all 7 categories of knowledge at a level comparable to modern scientific understanding, at least 5,000 years before the conventional timeline regards such sophistication as achievable. The tablet's astronomical corrections, however, point toward an observation epoch 12,000 years before the deposition date, suggesting that even this estimate is conservative, that the knowledge sealed at Eridu was itself already ancient when it was deposited, already the inheritance of a civilization that had received it from something older still. The cyclical pattern that the tablet's own closing statement invokes, that we are not the first and will not be the last, is not presented as tragedy. It is presented as structural knowledge to be understood, and, if sufficient wisdom accompanies sufficient capability, to be transcended. The preservation systems the tablet establishes, physical repositories, speaking vessel institutions, architecturally encoded monuments, were not built for the civilization that built them. They were built for us. Every technical confirmation that modern science has provided for the tablet's claims is not the validation of mythology. It is a message arriving from across the flood, from across whatever catastrophe separated the civilization that possessed this knowledge from the one that is only now beginning to recover it. We stand at a moment when our own technological capabilities approach the threshold that multiple ancient traditions consistently associate with civilizational transition, the point at which what we build either becomes the inheritance of what follows or becomes the evidence of what we failed to understand in time. The question the tablet asks of our civilization is not philosophical abstraction. It is an operational directive from an intelligence that understood, with the precision of 7 verified technical domains and the foresight to seal them behind a wall designed to outlast a flood, exactly what it meant to reach this threshold and exactly what is required to navigate it successfully. We are not the first civilization to have arrived here. We are the latest, and what we choose to seal within our own walls, what we leave behind for those who will eventually unbury our achievements and attempt to read our intentions across whatever silence follows us, will determine whether the civilization that comes after ours must begin the long reconstruction from nothing, or whether it will begin further along than we began. The instruction has been delivered. Whether we receive it is our own choice to make.